Jaron Jarvis Channel, Top 20 Scary Stories of the Day from Reddit nosleep. 2018-08-31. Story 1, 9 years and counting. I never was a rich kid. Dad worked long hard hours. Us kids never saw him much. Mom slaved in the kitchen. She put blood, sweat, and tears in just to make us happy. I wouldn't say I had the best early childhood. My father was a drunk. A working alcoholic is what my mother would call him. He liked to come home, drink a case of beer, and hit anybody who rubbed him the wrong way. After a while he started working so many hours that I didn't see him anymore. My mother was a sweet lady. She put up with more than she deserved. I had 2 older brothers, Josh and Mika. Josh was 2 years older than me and Mika was 3. Josh and Mika fought a lot. Josh would always make fun of his name. "You have a girl's name, pig breath." He would scream, trying to put his fear of his older brother in the back of his mind. Mika would simply just punch Josh in the face. That would then lead to a WWE match on our living room floor. Josh would sometimes win but mostly never. Josh was the nice one. He always stuck up for me. Mika was always mean to me, but he knew better than to put his hands on me. As I got older, and so did they, things changed. Mika grew worse. Always fighting at school, always yelling at Mom. Josh became the angle boy, as Mika would say. By the time my 10th birthday was coming up, both Mika and Josh had grown worse than distant. They never talked. They simply acted like one another was dead. Josh being 12 and Mika being 13 didn't help. Josh had been getting straight A's and getting awards left and right, while Mika had been getting terrible grades and just recently getting suspended for fighting. I bet you guys are wondering about me now, huh? Well, I'm Jessica. I was the only girl, so that meant I was Mom's miracle baby. 3rd time's the charm, right? She loved me and I loved her. She was very protective. Always watching us. Making sure we all stuck together. I loved her with all my heart. Mika hated me. He constantly picked on me and called me names. Josh, on the other hand, was the outstanding big brother. When I was younger, he would take my beatings for me. No matter what, he always made sure I was safe. A week before my 10th birthday, my father had moved out. He still sent every check to my mother, but that was the extent of hers and our relationship with my father. My mother didn't seem bothered by it. She was used to sleeping in bed alone and waking up alone. It was like the norm. Plus it meant no more drunken beatings for her. The abuse my father gave us ended for the kids right after my 8th birthday. That's when he worked more and we saw him less and less. However, for my mother it never stopped. I turned 10 on a Saturday. It was humidly hot. One of those days that you could even see the trees sweating. Me and Josh had plans to ask Mom if we could ride down to the local gas station together. We were almost certain she would say no. I told Josh that he had a better chance of convincing her. I was right. Soon Josh came running outside with $10. We hopped on each of our bikes and started to pedal. The ride there was great. We both felt more grown up. Josh looked over at me as we were pulling into the gas station and said out of the blue, "Sis, I love you." That was rare in our family. We never really said it. We just assumed that everybody knew. I laughed and told him he was the best big brother ever. We parked our bikes and ran in. Josh and I thought it'd be best to split the money. We headed to the freezer section and started looking for something to drink. Eventually we both picked Dr. Pepper. We headed to the candy aisle next. That's when Josh started to act weird. He began to visibly get nervous. "Josh, what's wrong?" I said, worried. He began to laugh and quietly said, "Get what you want and let's go." We both rushed and paid for our items. We basically ran to the door and hopped on our bikes. He told me to pedal fast. We took off down the road. He told me to take a left and circle back around. For a moment he looked back, and as soon as he did, he pedaled faster. When the house was, he looked back one more time. Then he began to relax. We dropped our bikes on the grass and ran inside. We headed upstairs and into his room. He slammed the door shut. As he walked towards me, I could see the sweat dripping down his face. He frantically started to pace back and forth and push his short brown hair back. Okay Jessica, listen. Listen very carefully. As we were walking into the candy aisle I saw a man. He was in dark clothes, a dark black hoodie and dark blue jeans. He kept staring at you. Then when I looked back at him he had a picture of you in his hand. That's why we had to go. There was something wrong. I looked at him and started laughing. Josh, you are freaking out over nothing. He started to laugh too and agreed he was probably overreacting. Later that night Mom told us to go out our bikes in the garage. I had the best bike in the whole neighborhood. It was pink with white stripes and had a bell and a basket. Josh's bike was a close second to mine. It was black and blue with basketballs all over it. As we ran outside I noticed something weird. My bike was moved. It was closer to the road. There was something else too. It had a white piece of paper tacked to it. Josh took off down our driveway and grabbed the bike. He ripped the note off of it and ran up. He handed it to me. His hand was shaking and his breath was shallow. I opened the note and it read the following. Today was the closest I'd ever been to you. Your hair smells too good. I'm so happy we are together. I'll be watching. Happy birthday. I began to feel my knees buckle. I couldn't catch my breath. Was this some sick joke? Just then I heard a yell from somewhere down the street. It was a deep manly voice. I love you Jessica. Story 2, The Lucky One. Any mother who has more than one child will admit if she's honest that she has one child who worries her more than the others. This has nothing to do with love, but rather some children's propensity to find trouble, a child most likely to get in a fight at school, or picked up by the police for breaking curfew, or, God forbid, getting into an accident. When I got the call at work that Tuesday morning at 3 a.m., my first thought was Alex. But it was not Alex. Not this time. It was John Susan. My sister gasped. They've airlifted him to Memorial. I don't know. Later, I wouldn't remember hanging up, wouldn't remember even leaving work. All I remembered was that drive to the hospital nearly an hour away, praying feverishly for my firstborn to be alive when I got there. I was the first of the family to arrive. I burst through the ER doors and ran to the front desk. John Andrews. I said. I'm his mother. The young nurse looked at her screen, then shot me a sympathetic look. The surgeons are looking him over right now. I'll send someone out to talk to you. She came around the desk, took my arm and guided me to a chair. I'll get someone right now. I hunched forward in the chair, looking down at the steel poking through the toe of my boots. Since Mark had died, this factory job had sustained us, but led to me being away from my boys at night. What had John been doing out at 3 a.m.? Still, he turned 19 last week. Admittedly, I didn't police him as hard as I did his 16-year-old brother Alex. John was grown. But at that moment, he was not. He was my baby. Mrs. Andrews? A voice said, and I looked up to see a balding man in scrubs. I stood on shaky legs. He introduced himself, but I didn't register his name. John? Is he? I couldn't ask. I burst into tears. He's alive, the doctor said quickly. For the injuries he's sustained, he's doing as well as we could hope for at this point. The EMTs said he was trying to sit up at the scene. He responded to simple commands. He's lucky. The doctor pulled out his phone and I saw he was on Facebook. We were wondering, the doctor said. Does John have a profile? We couldn't tell which John Andrews was him. I frowned. How could they not? But I pointed out his picture to the doctor anyway. John has extensive facial injuries, the doctor said. His head took most of the impact and he wasn't wearing a helmet. It looks like the ATV flipped and he hit the ground like this, shin first. He made a motion with his hands, like an arrow falling. He may have some back injury, but that is not our main concern with this first surgery. We need to get things back in the places they should be in. I barely heard him after that. 2 of my 4 siblings arrived at some point. They crowded in beside me. I felt my brother's arm on my waist, steadying me. The doctor asked if I wanted to go back and see John for a moment before he went into surgery. I nodded and he looked at my sister. She might need someone to come with her. My sister's arm replaced my brother's around my waist and we followed the doctor back. At least 6 people huddled around the bed in one corner of the curtained-off ER. They looked up and backed away when they saw us approach. I stared at the bed, uncomprehending. I almost said, "This isn't John." The poor person on the bed looked like something from a horror movie. A huge, swollen head, flattened nose caked in dried blood. The bottom half of his face, oh God, the bottom half was almost obliterated. His lips bloomed huge and shiny, misshapen and mismatched. The bottom one hung almost to his collarbone. My sister's fingers dug painfully into my side. "This isn't John," I wanted to say, but then I saw his tattoo, the one he'd gotten on his shoulder on his 18th birthday in memory of his father. My knees buckled. The doctor grabbed me too, and they half dragged me back out of the room. Someone jerked the curtain closed behind us and I wanted to stop them, wanted to speak. I hadn't even spoken to him. But I couldn't talk. I couldn't breathe. We stopped at a desk, near a computer screen. The doctor flipped it around to face me. It looked like a weatherman's radar imaging, except it was in the shape of a skull. It was lit in brilliant oranges, reds and yellows. He handed me a paper cup filled with water and urged me to drink while he explained what we were looking at. "John has a lot of facial trauma," the doctor said. "He has breaks in his forehead, his cheekbones, his nose, both jaws, the roof of his mouth. You can break the roof of your mouth." I thought numbly. This first surgery is to repair his jaw, and to set his palate. It'll all be wired shut. I don't know if we will try to tackle anything above the jaw today. That might be tomorrow, because this is a pretty involved surgery. I'd say we're looking at least 6 hours. The doctor patted my arm. The emergency workers said he was conscious at the scene. He responded to simple commands. "He's strong, Mrs. Andrews. We just have to pray at this point that we are able to control the swelling." My sister asked questions, but I barely heard any of them. The white noise that began in the room with John was now a steady roar. Bile rose in my throat and I clamped my hand over my mouth. The next thing I knew, I was in a restroom, retching, while my sister held my hair back. In the waiting room, my brother David arrived with Alex. I grabbed Alex and hugged him tight. "He's so hurt," I whispered. "He's so hurt." The surgery took nearly 7 hours, but the doctor was smiling the next time we saw him. He did well. We're pleased to be where we're at right now. He's a very lucky boy. We didn't get a chance to work on his cheekbones today, or his forehead. Let's wait a day or two on that, see how the swelling goes. Right now, it looks like he only has a small brain bleed and I think his body will absorb that. We just need the swelling to not get worse. He's been moved up to trauma on the 4th floor. Visiting hours are over for today, but I'll tell them to let Mom and one person in to see him for a few minutes. "I'm going in with Mom," Alex said. "He looks rough," my sister said. "Are you sure you want to see him yet?" "I'm going in with her," Alex repeated. On the 4th floor, I had to pick up a phone that hung outside the automatic doors to announce we were there. A nurse buzzed us in. She instructed us to use the hand sanitizer on the wall. Then she led us to room 7. "Lucky 7, she said, with a determinedly cheerful smile. Alex slipped his hand in mine just before the nurse drew back the curtain. I gasped, and Alex's fingers tightened around mine, but he misunderstood. It was a relieved gasp. Even though John still looked terrible, still unrecognizable, he was so much better than he'd been in that emergency room. His face was back into a shape that was human, hopeful. Swathed in bandages, but at least no longer mangled and hanging. Beeping, whirring machinery surrounded him. He had a trachea tube in his throat. "My God," Alex choked out, and I realized what he was seeing. He did not know how good this was. "This is so much better," I whispered, and moved to take John's slack, cool hand in mine. I would not forget to speak to him this time. "Hey, baby," I said. "Alex and I are here. The doctor said you did so good. It's going to be okay. We love you. You're going to get better." And, over the next couple of weeks, that seemed to be what was happening. John remained unconscious, but the nurses assured us that was mostly medically induced. He had 3 more surgeries, the worst being when they peeled back his face to put plates in his forehead and rebuild his cheekbones. But the stitches were so small and fine, and I wondered if they would even scar very much. He was so lucky. Then one day, while Alex and I were visiting, I saw a slit of blue eye through his swollen, purple eyelids. The nurse paused as she changed his for and said, "Well, look who's awake." "John," she said loudly. "Do you know who these people are?" He nodded yes. I clutched one hand, Alex the other. That one blue eye tracked my face. "Hey, baby," I said, and he squeezed my fingers. "Do you know where you are?" He shook his head no. "You're in the hospital. You wrecked your ATV. You're going to be okay, though. I'm so happy you're awake." Alex walked around the bedside, and I asked, "Do you know this guy?" John nodded and pulled his hand from mine. He made a fist and Alex did too. They gave each other a fist bump, their standard greeting. Alex and I both started to cry. It felt like a streak of sunlight in the darkness, the end of a terrible journey. We did not realize it was just the beginning. Along with John's consciousness, a new problem emerged. He developed some sort of mania about all the tubes he was connected to. Relentlessly, he tried to pull out his feeding tube track. But mostly, he tried to unwire his jaw. He could reach inside his mouth just enough to wiggle the strands of metal. More than once, I found long silver wires in his bed where he'd succeeded in extracting one. The nurses didn't seem as worried about that as they did when he tried to pull on the feeding tube in his stomach. They put restraints on him when he tried to do that, and he became measurably more agitated. The nurse would ask him questions every day, but now, they made him write on a whiteboard. He'd write his name, his birthday, the year. One day, she asked if he knew where he was. He wrote dentist. That tore at me. In his mind, he was at the dentist visit from hell. They said it was normal for him to be so confused, that his brain had taken quite a jarring. Hopefully, that would subside in time. Soon, he was moved out of trauma to a regular room, where I could stay with him 24/7. I was grateful for this, but his constant fidgeting and pulling made me a nervous wreck. I refused to leave him though. He needed his mother. Thankfully, my work was very kind about this, even when days stretched into weeks. He hated his jaws being wired. When they put a cap over the tube in his throat, he could talk with surprising clarity, though he seemed to forget he could. Mostly, he would beg for water or Mountain Dew. He was not allowed to drink anything, and it broke my heart for him to beg me for water, or for me to take him home. Finally, one nurse gave me a cup with about an inch of water in the bottom of it and a small quarter-sized sponge on a stick. I was allowed to dip the sponge in the water and stick it in John's mouth. His jaws were completely wired shut, but he could still suck greedily on it. It was never enough. I swore to him that as soon as he was allowed, I'd buy him all the Mountain Dew he could drink. I wasn't prepared for the mood swings, the anger. That wasn't anything like John. In his entire existence, I could only remember arguing with him 3 times, unlike the shouting matches Alex and I sometimes had. It was almost funny, but then not. One day when I was fussing with him to stop pulling at tubes and he was telling me to shut up with his hands. There was the opening and closing of fingers to thumb, like a mouth clamping shut, the wagging of a finger in my face, then the finger to the lips, like SHH. I've never been told to shut up in so many ways without a single word. I told my brother that evening. He'd also cracked 3 vertebrae in his back and 2 in his neck. He wore a neck brace all the time and had to have a chest one whenever he was allowed to sit or stand. He developed a new obsession with getting out of bed when I was sleeping and he wasn't allowed to do that, especially without the brace. The nurses warned him that he could still paralyze himself with one wrong move, but he was relentless. I felt like I hadn't slept in weeks. They put alarms on his bed that would go off every time he tried to get up, which meant all night long. The most freedom he had was being able to walk to the restroom, in all those braces. He'd also cheat on the water ban. After washing his hands, he'd fill them with water from the sink and lap it like a dog. I stopped fighting him on that one. The physical therapists all said he was doing well and that he was strong. I began to worry more about his mind than his body. One night, he motioned for his whiteboard and wrote, "Did I die? Is this hell?" That shocked me, and I wondered what was going on in his mind. After nearly 4 weeks, he seemed almost normal sometimes. I'd get to a place where I thought the fingers of his concussion were losing their grip, then he'd say something off the wall and throw me for another loop. He asked for his father. He asked for the best friend who had moved away when he was in 4th grade. Then, they arrived. "Make them get out," he wrote. "Make them leave." Who? The nurses? I asked in confusion. We were completely alone in his room. He paused, his frustration etched on the face that was slowly regaining its features. Then he threw the pen across the room. "The Mick Jaggers," he hissed through his wired jaws. I laughed. It was so unexpected, I couldn't help it. I didn't know John even knew who that was. He got mad and threw the board across the room. It hit the door with a whack. "I'm sorry," I said. "Did you say the Mick Jaggers?" He nodded fiercely. Emphatically. Whoever the Mick Jaggers were, they tormented him day and night. One day, I showed him pictures of both a young and an old Mick Jagger and he said, "Who's that?" I replied, "That's Mick Jagger." John rolled his eyes and said, "That is not a Mick Jagger." Physically, his improvement was remarkable, but mentally, the doctors reassured me that it might take a while for his brain to recover. He might always have a few quirks, but they didn't understand. He seemed so fundamentally different. He seemed so sad, pensive, choosing not to talk but to stare off into space. I thought that might improve when he finally got to go home, but it didn't. Friends came to visit, but he didn't interact much with them. The beautiful girl he dated since his senior year tried to visit a few times, but then one day she left in tears. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Andrews," she sobbed. "It doesn't feel like him." I wanted to be angry at her for her abandonment, but how could I be when I felt the same thing? The boy in that room looked like my son more and more every day, but he didn't act anything like him. Every once in a while, especially when he was with Alex, I saw a ghost of the boy he'd been and wondered if the John we knew was still in there, fighting his way back through all the Mick Jaggers. I ran into a neighbor one day at the grocery store. My sister and Alex stayed home with John so I could do a few errands. The neighbor, Brenna, asked about him, and I gave her stock reply that he was doing great, considering. "Happy to be home." Brenna gave me a sad smile. "He was so lucky," she said. Brenna's son, Matthew, hadn't been lucky. He'd wrapped his car around a telephone pole on graduation night 3 years ago and died instantly. That night, John went off on one of his rages about the Mick Jaggers. He smashed all his baseball pictures, threw his trophies against the wall while he screamed and cursed. Alex quietly went to his room and shut the door behind him. He did that more and more lately, and I knew he needed my attention as well, but I felt stretched so thin. Neither of us knew how to cope with the angry, sad stranger we'd brought home from the hospital. "Is this hell?" John had asked, and I wasn't for sure. Then I felt guilty for thinking that. It was all going to be okay, I told myself. He was in there somewhere. He'd be back. After all, he was the lucky one. Story 3, The Co-worker. I always knew something was not right with my co-worker. I've worked at a job as a cashier for 8 years. Then one day, a tall, skinny, white man, red hair, freckles all over his face, looking about 28 to 30 years old had started working here also, stacking shelves. Let's just call him John. At first he was really kind and friendly, but then something seemed off. Like he was too clingy, always inviting me out or over to his house for dinner. I would always catch him staring at me a weird kind of way, and he would hurriedly look away. Well, one Wednesday he kept being persistent about it all, and I told him yes, I would go to dinner with him the Friday. The Thursday came and he kept reminding me about Friday. All during the day he would keep bothering me about it. He kept saying we could go right after work, no need going home to change off or freshen up or anything. I started to feel alerted. He kept going at it. The way he talked about it was as if a child was excited about a hunting trip. I was very scared at this point. It was all very weird. So Friday came, and I called in sick at work. I got a lot of missed calls from an unknown number, and you can be sure I never picked it up. In total it was about 78 missed calls. At about 11 p.m., I got a call from my boss saying John seemed worried about me and he gave John my number to call and check up earlier the morning. I was so pissed but I never said anything. At this point I was kinda like nervous and I was trying to convince myself I was overreacting. I then decided to go visit my sister a couple miles away for the weekend. So I packed up and went away. When I reached at home the Sunday evening, my door was open. And from outside I could see my house was ransacked. I called the police, and waited outside until they showed up. They searched my house and made sure it was safe for me to go in. In the kitchen, plates were broken. In the living room, my TV screen was smashed. The sofa ripped up and cups and kitchen utensils all over my floor. Someone defecated on my carpet and on my bed upstairs. My underwear drawer was nearly empty, I must tell you. I made a report and told them about John. Naturally my suspicions fell on him. The night ended with the police saying they will leave a cop outside for the night in case the perpetrator returned, and Monday morning they would have a talk with John. That night someone was sneaking up at my house, coming from the back around and to the front door. When the police called out to the man, whoever he was, he ran. Bright and early Monday morning, the policeman accompanied me to work. When we arrived, John was nowhere to be seen, and he is always early. I relayed everything to my boss, and upon him bringing out John's information he gave on his resume, the information was all fake. Despite many attempts, the police could not locate John. The number he called me from was for a young lady that went missing couple months prior. From that day John never came back and I felt like I was being followed, so I quit my job, moved out and started carrying a gun. What a haphazard those 2 months had been. So about 4 months later, police got a distress call from a house about 10 miles from my former home and responded quickly. Upon reaching there, as they stepped inside there was a very bad odor, seeming to come from every part of the house. There were many photos and albums of John, thus meaning it was his house. They climbed the steps and checked each one of the rooms. I don't know the extent of what they found out, due to the fact that this is an ongoing investigation and I was just told a bit because I reported him prior to this, but I do know that John has been hopping from job to job and getting attached to certain young women. He would then invite them out and take them to eat, thus drugging them and taking them to his house where he would proceed to try and make them into mummified dolls by experimenting with their brain. When they died he would then take out their insides and hang up their carcass as prizes. I guess one girl got lucky when he forgot to close the door to the room she was in. She escaped downstairs and called the police. John was never caught, and to this day I'm scared he might show up to my front door, but I do know I have a gun waiting on him if he does. Story 4, Laszlo's book. I've read that some old French guy said, hell is other people. I think he only said that because they didn't have middle schools when he was alive. We all go through it like Dante with a lunch plan. Most kids are desperate to be liked, to fit in, to avoid being ostracized. I'd compare it to prison, except there you don't have to worry about what you wear. Both places you get in a group or a gang and stick with it for identity and protection. It's good practice for high school. Everyone finds their tribe. Everyone but me, that is. I found Laszlo. I transferred to a new school after my old one burned down. It was more or less the same distance from my house but in the opposite direction. Might as well have been on the moon. I didn't know a soul, and they didn't want to know me. There were a few kids from my old school but they found new friends and pretended not to know me, except to gossip and tell everyone I was a loser. What did I ever do to them? Didn't matter. Laszlo and I were both social rejects. Of course we were going to end up hanging out with each other. I ran into him on the end of my first day. No, really. I was running around the back of the school after I spotted some bullies working over a kid. Didn't want to catch their eye, so I slinked away and was walking at a fast clip around the corner when I tripped over Laszlo. He was on his knees in the shade of the building wall, doing something over one of those candles in the glass cup like you see in church. He was waving his hands all around and chanting a poem or something. He didn't even see me for a few moments. Then he clapped his hands so hard the candle went out, yelled a word I didn't know and looked up at me. He had a crooked smile that split his acne-covered face beneath a mop of hair that looked like a copper scrub pad. I was too startled to say anything, so we both looked at each other a moment in silence. Then we heard the scream, "Hot damn, it worked." The smile exploded into a grin as he jumped to his feet and ran back the way I'd come. Totally confused, I followed. A bunch of kids were crowded around the lead bully. He was lying on the ground in a fetal position, clutching his head and screaming. One of the teachers ran up. "What the hell happened? Who hit him?" "No one kid said. He just fell down and started yelling." Laszlo barely stifled a snorting laugh. The teacher noticed and with a frown sent all of us away as he called 911. I found myself walking towards home with Laszlo, who seemed very amused with himself. "I did it," he finally said. "I did that." "How?" I asked. "It was in the book I found. A grim something. It's full of magic spells. There's spells for everything. Make a girl like you, get money, even hurt someone. There's lots of those." I thought about things a moment while we walked. "How did you know that bully was going to be there?" "Jerry, he's always pulling stuff like that. Picks on the kids who can't fight back. He gave me notice last week at lunch. 'Gonna find you soon,' he said. Well, I found him first. By now we were walking down a street of older houses. He stopped at a particularly drab one and opened the chain-link gate. 'My name's Laszlo, by the way. Don't think I've seen you around before.' 'I'm Ray,' I said, and we shook hands like adults do. 'Pleased to meet ya, Ray.' He paused, grinned again. 'Want to see the book?' Like he had to ask. 'Sure. All right, come on in.' The inside of Laszlo's house was as drab as the outside. Looking back, I have to wonder if whoever did the decorating was colorblind. He threw his backpack on a kitchen chair. 'My parents won't be home till later. How about your brothers and sisters?' 'Got none.' He went into another room for a moment, then came back with a big leather-bound book that he put on the kitchen table. 'Here it is. I found it in my grandpa Pavel's house when he died. He had a special closet that was chock full of weird stuff. Wavy knives, little statues, even a big cup like you see at church. This was the only thing I could sneak out before my mom found the closet. Boy, did she freak out.' He opened the cover. I could tell from the way the text was printed that it was an old book, older than paint. The front page had the title, Grimoire du Soleil Noir. Translated from the French. By Patrick Moore. Chipwith and Sons, London, 1804. I know now from my adult research that this was a textbook, a complete system of magic that predated Crowley, Levi, and all the rest. Reverend Wollstonecraft had considered mentioning it and Moore in his Lives of the Necromancers but refrained out of concern that it might encourage others to seek it out. It was one of 100 privately printed copies. It was rare, it was potent, and had I the power I would reach back through time and set a match to it. But on that day, to my little middle school mind, it was the most awesome thing in the world. There was a section on dealing with the dead, another on potions and poisons, and page after page of magic rituals and spells. Most pages had notes scribbled in the margins. Several hands had made observations and added formulae all over the place. There were also a few loose pages stuffed inside the back cover with additional spells. I said exactly what you'd expect a 13-year-old boy to say. Cool. I know, right? Laszlo flipped to a page in the middle. This is the one I used on Jerry. And this, he said as he flipped to another, is one I used to get Miss Pollark to stay home on that big test day. Gave her cramps. He showed me a few others but it was all Greek to me. I mean, it didn't look like Greek, it was all in English. But what little I did read was full of words like Widdershins and Arcane and Baphomet. There were plenty of drawings that looked like someone had a seizure while using a spirograph. I'll bet Laszlo read it with a dictionary open and Google up on his computer. This stuff looks pretty hard, I finally admitted. Nah, it's like a cookbook. Just follow the directions. Something about that didn't quite jibe with me. The book was too complicated looking to be that simple. But what did I know? Laszlo was talking from experience. It was right around then that his mom came home, so he quickly put the book back in his room and we spent some time playing Xbox. When I got home that night I looked up Laszlo's book online. There wasn't a lot about it. The Wikipedia page was a stub. I found one of those homemade occult sites that mentioned a copy went down with the Titanic, and that there was a secret copy for faculty use only at the Widener at Harvard. That was pretty much it, so I started searching on the word grimoire. I learned that there were lots of grimoires from ancient times, like one called the Greek magical papyri. There were a whole bunch from the Renaissance and even some from modern times. And there were warnings, like the one entry that said the writers of grimoires and alchemical texts would often write their works in code, using names and phrases known only to their fellow adepts. More, they were prone to making intentional errors in their rituals and formulae in order to confound the tyro. Such errors would be obvious to the magus and so easily corrected. Persons attempting to recite the contents verbatim would endure frustration and failure, or suffer the consequences of contacting forces beyond their understanding without taking the necessary precautions. I couldn't help but be curious what the author meant by necessary precautions. I've never been a reckless guy, even as a kid. Measure twice, cut once, my dad would say, and I took it to heart. So over the next few days I started reading up. I didn't know it then, but it was the beginning of a lifelong study of the occult. It was total amateur hour, of course. Websites and old encyclopedia entries. I even joined a couple of Facebook forums on magic. My first question to the group drew a lot of responses. What's the first thing you teach me if I wanted to learn grimoire magic? Haters aside, I got a few responses. First thing I'd teach you is that there's no such thing as grimoire magic. That's a book, not a system. He then went on for several paragraphs. Another guy said, I'd tell you not to bother, you'll only get yourself in trouble. Stuff like that. But it was a woman who called herself Belle of the Bale that replied, a banishing ritual. Ever see Mickey Mouse in Fantasia? The Sorcerer's Apprentice? A simple spell went horribly wrong and it nearly killed him because he couldn't banish it. You need to do a banishing ritual at the start and finish of every magical operation, the first to ensure there's nothing hanging around that might interfere, the second to get rid of whatever you invoked. You're only asking for trouble if you don't. I ended up meeting Belle years later. Boy, that was a hoot. Tell you about it some other time. She included in her post a link to a page with a banishing ritual from an old group of magicians called the Golden Dawn. Most of their other stuff was too, well, stuffy, but the banishing ritual was simple enough even for me. I bookmarked it and read it till it was burned into my brain. It was a few days before I hung out with Laszlo again. We didn't have any classes together and I didn't see him in the halls. In the interim, one of the gym teachers got sent to the hospital after collapsing with bad cramps during a game. I saw him puke up a bunch of ants while the EMTs were putting him on the gurney. And a girl in our grade named Sally Perkins had some kind of freak out in the halls, screaming that there was a black cloud full of eyes following her. She didn't come back to school for a while after that. When I did finally talk to Laszlo again, he had a grin on his face like someone who had a secret to tell. Hey Ray, want to come over later tonight? I want to try something in the book, and I could use some help. Okay, sure. What do you want to do? There's a ritual for calling up a magical helper. I want to give it a try. I couldn't help but think if Mickey, drowning as an endless line of brooms with buckets dumped water on his head. He must have seen the look on my face. What? It's all in there, everything we need. I just need a second person to do some stuff. What you say? I should have said no, but I didn't. The desire to try some real magic was too strong. Okay, let's do it. Laszlo got even more excited. Cool. Come on over after dinner. My parents are going out for the night. We can do what we want. I got there right about sundown. Laszlo answered the door in a red robe that looked homemade. Hey, good timing. I was just finishing setting up. We went into the back den where he'd pushed aside the furniture to clear the center of the room. There he'd drawn a circle in some white powder on the hardwood floor. I sniffed a familiar odor. It's Kitty Fresh Carpet Cleaner, he said with self-satisfaction. That way I can vacuum it up after and my parents will never know. I nodded and kept looking around. There were tea light candles at 5 spots outside the circle. A TV tray held the book, some matches, a Ziploc bag of something grey, and a big butcher's knife. We're good to go, so we can get started right away. Take off your shirt. What? The book says you need to be shirtless. It's part of the ritual. Dude, that's okay, fine, I said with a huff. I took off my shirt and threw it on a chair as he went around and lit the candles with the matches. Now what? Laszlo looked a bit nervous, edgy. Was he really that sure whatever he was doing was going to work? Maybe he was afraid his parents would come home early. Whatever it was, he seemed eager to get on with it. Okay, you kneel right there, in front of the circle, while I recite the ritual. We looked at each other a moment before I shrugged and did as he asked. I didn't like the feel of this at all. Was he about to play a prank on me? I imagined him dumping a bucket of goo on my head like some old Nickelodeon sketch. He picked up the book instead and, standing behind me, opened it to a bookmarked page. After a somewhat dramatic clearing of his throat began to chant. I won't tell you what he said largely because I don't remember most of it. What I do remember is watching the change in the circle in front of me. The candles seemed to burn a little bit brighter as the air inside it took on a reddish hue. I thought it was a gag, at first. Maybe Laszlo had gone downtown and picked up some cheap DJ lights, put a red one somewhere behind me to make the effect. Then a swirling mist of black dust started to thicken in the red light, moving and coming together. Eventually it formed the shape of a tall, slim man dressed like someone out of A Christmas Carol, complete with top hat and cane. A man of wealth and taste. I was dumbfounded. What had I seen? This guy just appears out of nowhere right in front of me. He stood there in a circle and glowered at me with silent disapproval, like he'd been expecting chocolate and got tuna fish instead. Then he looked up and passed me at Laszlo and said in a posh Hertfordshire accent, "What the bloody hell is this mess?" I knelt there in shock as Laszlo fumbled behind me. You fucking amateur, the stranger continued. What have you got there, the Selenoir? In English? Lazy clod. He glanced at me and jabbed his cane dangerously close to my face as he went on. And, what's your excuse for this, eh? It clearly states in there that the sacrifice is to be a virgin girl of marrying age. I blinked hard at that. Sacrifice? The stranger went on. That look like a girl to you? Bloody stable boy is what he is, scrawny one, too. Scrawny? I said, a bit hurt. He didn't bother to look at me. Oh, shut up. I heard Laszlo pick something up with a scraping sound. Must have been the butcher's knife. He began shouting in a shaky voice. I command thee in the name of Proserpo, of Iago, and of Puck to bow to my dominion. Right. Look, sport, those are not names of power. They're characters from Shakespeare. The pen may be mightier than the sword, but it don't cut here. I couldn't help but laugh a little. The posh man glanced at me and pointed. See? He gets it. Laszlo was losing his cool. Next thing I knew, the bag of grey powder was flying by my left ear and into the circle, where it landed at the stranger's feet, still sealed. He, in turn, stared at it for a moment before saying quietly, I don't even know what that is. Ah. Laszlo yelled in a mix of fear and frustration. I command you. No, you don't. You tried to cheat, take a few shortcuts. You can get away with that sort of thing for the small stuff. But with me, that's a deal breaker. All bets are off. The stranger raised his nose and took a sniff. You smell like old Pavel. And a litter box, but mostly like old Pavel. That git had me running errands for decades. His voice took on a darker tone. Took a long time for me to get to him, and here you are, giving yourself to me on a silver salver. Almost makes up for it. With dramatic slowness and a crooked smile he stepped out of the circle and passed me towards Laszlo. The would-be wizard screamed as the stranger said, "Time to go see Grandpa." I don't even know how to describe the sound I heard next. All I know is that it came with a hot, wet wind at my back, and the sound of Laszlo's pleading seeming to fade into the distance. I was terrified. Too scared to move, I knelt there and waited until everything went silent. Then I waited a minute or two more. Sure that I was alone, I breathed a huge sigh of relief. Now, what do we do about you? My blood went cold. He was still there, standing right behind me. Somehow I was able to choke out as I rose to my feet, "Nothing." He stepped back into the circle to face me directly. "I know this was all your friend's fault, and I could see in his mind how he tricked you. Dirty pool, that. But you did want to be here, and that makes you part of the show. I can't simply let you walk away unscathed. It would be bad for my reputation, you understand. Perhaps an interesting disease is in order, or a trip to the asylum. What do you say?" I did the only thing I could think to do. I raised my hands and made the signs as they were on that web page, and began to recite the banishing ritual. A strange tingling ran up my spine to the back of my head, and out to my hands as the air around them seemed to electrify. In the circle, the air turned a pale green as the stranger looked at me first in surprise, then with a laughing delight like a child who had seen a magic show trick. He began to crumble as he laughed, giving me a little wave with his free hand before finally turning to a swirl of black dust, then to nothing. I looked about as the room returned to normal. Laszlo was gone. So was his book. I didn't bother to call out for him. I knew he wouldn't answer. All I did was grab my shirt and run out the front door. I've never told a soul what happened that night. When the police came around asking questions, I told them I'd left his house early. They never found him. Officially, he's a runaway. That was the end of all that, except for the envelope without a return address that came in the mail about a week later. The only thing inside was a card made of expensive paper, on which was written in an elegant cursive, "Be seeing you." Story 5, I witnessed a man murdered in his apartment and now the murderer is after me and I can't tell anyone. I witnessed a man murdered in his apartment, and now the murderer is after me and I can't tell anyone. I guess for any of this to make sense you need to know who I am first. I don't want to release much personal information about myself, privacy reasons and whatnot, but the biggest thing you should know is that people call me a creep. I don't think I am a creep. I think there are much worse people out there who that should be reserved for. I prefer to call myself a very dedicated people watcher. I first got into people watching some Friday night when I visited a house party on the roof of some guy's apartment building. Everyone was off drinking, talking, and doing other things. I wasn't. I only knew my friend and he had already headed off with some chick to her place, so I was alone, left to watch the bustling city below us. I was considering leaving when motion in an apartment building opposite us caught my attention. It was a little far to see, smaller apartment buildings or places of business making up the distance, but I could see the light of the apartment on the top floor turn on. The building itself was interesting. When I first moved to the city it had been a possible living place. All of the apartments were 2 rooms, one room had a kitchen, space for a table and chairs, and a lounge area. The second room was the bedroom with the adjacent ensuite. Nice swanky place, really expensive though. What made the apartment stand out though was the floor-to-ceiling window that panned the whole wall of both rooms, meaning if you didn't close those curtains everyone could see everything that was happening inside. Anyways, I divert. The light turned on and some guy entered. 40-something business-looking man, dressed up in a suit and tie. He had a much younger lady on his arm and they were both heavily intoxicated. They kept giggling and bouncing off of random surfaces until they finally made their way to the bedroom. It was here that the man closed the bedroom door and bounced on the girl. But, and this is where it gets interesting, he didn't shut the window. Maybe it was the fact he was intoxicated, or the fact he was in the tallest apartment for miles around, including the one I was standing on, and he felt no one could see. Either way he didn't and I couldn't help but watch. It was fascinating. watching this life happen, and they had no clue I was even there. Maybe 30 odd minutes passed before both of them passed out, lights still on. I was so engrossed in watching that I continued to stare at them, their small chests rising and fall in smooth motions, before I finally turned around to get a drink. I noticed that the numbers had drastically dwindled to only a few people and the host who were still here, talking softly. I turned to glance back at the building, but nothing more was happening. There were a few more lights on, but it was just people walking around, reading, watching TV. I decided to leave. I spent the next week going about my normal boring routine, but the closer Friday got the more I remembered what I had seen. I wondered how their life was going. Would the man return with a different girl or the same? What was his business, her business? It drove me insane to the point that I couldn't stop thinking about it. It consumed my thoughts. I had to find out. That Friday, exactly 1 week later, I returned to the party guy's building. There was a key code outside, but that did not prove to be a problem. I just came in behind this girl returning from her workout and watched her enter the code, jotting it down on my hand after she had left. Once I was on the roof, I propped the door open with this piece of pipe and slid a chair over from a table and sat down. I had brought binoculars this time. While I had been able to make out everything fairly clearly, binoculars would certainly make it easier on my eyes. I sat on that roof for almost the whole night. I arrived at 9 p.m. and didn't leave until 4 a.m. Some of it was quite boring, but I didn't leave until everyone had come home and gone to sleep. I wanted to make sure I saw everything. I will admit, the majority of that night was nothing interesting, but I did get to meet the residents. I will mention some of the more interesting characters. Well, there was businessman on the top floor. He seemed to have a very high-end job, guessing by the amount of rich people crap lying around. 2 floors below him was an apartment of 4 uni girls living off campus for what I guessed to be their 3rd year. They were the type of preppy party girls I despised, and they acted just as I had always guessed they would. They were interesting to watch, just to scoff at how naive they were to how the real world was. 1 floor below them was Mr. Boring. I hated watching him, but often he was one of the last people up. He would arrive home around 6, eat dinner from takeout boxes, and then work on his computer until 2 a.m. His apartment was also the most boring, with almost nothing except books, a table, a chair, a bed, and some clothes that all looked the same. And finally, 3 floors below him, was a couple with a 4-year-old son. I liked watching them. They were looking for a new apartment, newspaper clippings lying all about with red circles. The son made a mess everywhere and they were having trouble controlling him. Often, once the parents were asleep, the young boy would get up and draw on the wall. He was a smart kid and would cover it up with paper drawings hung up with blue tack. I liked watching him because he was cute. I watched those people mainly because they were the ones who were too negligent to close their blinds, but also because I found them fascinating. And thus, my Friday night tradition was born. Every Friday I would bring my binoculars, sneak upstairs, and watch these people live their lives. It was addicting, intoxicating. Like reading a good book, but it never had to end. The first few weeks were difficult in terms of trying to get out of plans in order to go watch. The first 2 people who asked why I couldn't come, I stupidly told them the truth. They never spoke to me again. In response, I developed a more believable lie and just told everyone it until they stopped inviting me out on Friday nights altogether. I did this for 3 months. Every Friday I was there, and I learned many different things. For instance, businessman was married with 3 teenage daughters. I know cause one day his wife and kids visited. This didn't really seem to matter much to him though, as he continued the habit of bringing that same girl back to his apartment. I think they worked together since they were both always wearing office outfits. The slutty uni girls were having disputes and 2 had moved out. Mr. Boring never changed his routine, and at this point I watched him because something interesting had to happen at some point. The couple with the toddler had bought an apartment and had started packing. I was sad to see them go. There was this one particular Friday night, which is the reason I am writing this, And the reason I am huddled on my bathroom floor, so let me just start. It had been a particularly slow night. Businessman must have had trouble with his lady friend because she was absent and he went to bed early. The uni girls were still out, and the couple had sent the sun away that night, but they remembered to close their curtains before turning in, so no entertainment from them. This left Mr. Boring, which meant I was in for a slow night, so I put in my headphones in to listen to a podcast. Around 1 a.m. Mr. Boring took a book and went and laid on his bed, facing the window so his back was to the door of his bedroom. At 1:30 a.m. the door opened. This caught my attention. Mr. Boring had never had someone over before. I didn't think anyone even had a key. Mr. Boring didn't seem to notice, not turning over, completely engrossed in his book. It was then that I noticed who had entered. It seemed to be a man, but was difficult to tell. He wore baggy jeans, dirty black sneakers, and a baggy black hoodie with the hood up so it obscured his face. He walked slowly through the dining room, veering just slightly so as to go to the kitchen counters. The man picked up a knife from where a rack of them was stored and studied it, turning it over in his gloved hands while the moonlight glinting off it ominously. I then watched, my arms trembling slightly, as he made his way into the room Mr. Boring was reading in. I couldn't help but watch, although doing so gave me a sickly feeling. As the man crept closer, I willed Mr. Boring to turn around, to need to use the restroom, to decide to go to sleep, anything. But he didn't, he just lay on his side blissfully unaware. In one smooth motion the shrouded man raised the knife and brought it down in Mr. Boring's side. Mr. Boring reacted in a spasm, clutching his side, eyes and mouth open in what I could only imagine was a scream. He rolled over and kicked out at the attacker, who gave a slight recoil, but Mr. Boring was by no means strong and the attacker was very quickly back in control. He advanced on Mr. Boring, creeping closer as Mr. Boring jumped around to the other side of the bed, the side closest to the window so that his back was pressed up against it and I had full body view of what was going on. Mr. Boring grabbed everything he could from his nightstand, books, lamp, clock, figurines, whatever, and threw them at the attacker. But the shrouded man dodged every one of them, his wiry frame making him unnaturally quick. In a matter of seconds he was standing next to Mr. Boring, and before he could even react the shrouded man brought the knife down again into Mr. Boring's chest. Mr. Boring fell to his knees in pain, clutching the blood with one hand and the other raised in a feeble attempt to ward off the attack, but the knife kept coming, stabbing at the chest again and again, spattering the window through which I watched as the blood dripped down slowly. It was gruesome. Even after Mr. Boring was down, obviously dead, the killer kept stabbing, the chest, the neck, the head, slashing the arms and legs until his body was beyond mutilated. Finally it was done. The killer stood up slowly, looking down at his handiwork. He stood there for a full minute, just not moving. I was in complete shock. Shakily I got to my feet and in a trance-like state I backed away as quickly as I could towards the door. It was at this moment that the killer snapped his head towards the window and stared out it. My knees buckled and I felt all the blood rush from my face as I realized he saw me, the moon silhouetting my dark shape upon the rooftop. I could see his face now, the hood having dropped back slightly. He was pale, pale as the snow in the street below, which made the blood that spattered his face stand out as a pattern to the gruesome event I had just witnessed. His cheeks were sunken in and curved around his face so he looked just like a skinless skull. His eyes were white, and without my binoculars I couldn't see any sort of irises within. Our eyes collided, each studying the other's face. His thin lips spread across his face farther than I thought possible into what was a sick grin. It was at that point I ran. Not heroic, I know, but I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to look at his face anymore, or give him any more time to look at mine, so I just ran. I ran down all 30 flights of stairs, through the car park until I found my car and drove away as fast as I could. 2 weeks passed since I saw that and I hadn't gone back. Actually, except to go to work I had barely left my home. Every night when I laid down to go to sleep I would see it, Mr. Boring's twisted face and mutilated body. The killer, standing over him, dripping with blood, looking at me. I tried to forget it, I really did, but the memory just haunted me. You may be wondering why I didn't go to the police. I had seen the killer's face after all. I guess the answer is fairly simple. I wasn't exactly fully exempt of the law myself. I had been going up there for so long, watching those people, no doubt that would be found out and it could cause me some problems. I didn't want to face anyone who could judge me for that, especially the people who I was watching. I didn't want to see their faces twisted in disgust at me. They were the only continual people in my life who I could judge and they could not judge me back. I didn't want to see that on their face. Besides, I hadn't seen the killer since, and from following it on the news they had some pretty good suspects and leads, so I didn't feel a need for me to interfere. I just wanted to put it all behind me and live my life, and it seemed I could do that. At least that was what I thought, until one Tuesday while I was leaving work. I had just started to get on the tram to take me home when I spotted him out of the window, standing there on the sidewalk. He was a small-framed man with greasy brown hair sticking to the sides of his thin face. I almost didn't recognize him, had almost forgotten him, until he smiled that same ghastly smile at me and I felt my blood run cold. Just as my tram started and pulled away, he began to wave to me, head following me until the tram turned a corner and I lost sight of him. I was so shocked I couldn't stop shaking all over again. All memories of that horrid night returned in full and I sank down in the seat, overwhelmed with emotion and fright. When I returned to work the next morning, beginning to walk towards the building, I saw the man still standing there, same place as the night before. He spotted me and began to smile, walking towards me at disturbingly slow pace to how fast I knew he could move. Had he been there all night? It looked like he had, but I didn't give it much thought. Stumbling over myself, I turned and ran back towards the tram. I quickly hopped on one right as it was leaving the stop, not caring where it was going. I had to pay a fine for not having a ticket, which I was more than willing to do. I was also more than willing to call my job right then and there and quit. Now this is where the past catches up with the present. It has been 4 days since I saw him at my work and I have barely left the house since, yet it has gotten worse. I started writing this yesterday because I saw him at my local grocery store when I went for food. He was just standing there. I was not sure if he had seen me, but I didn't want to take that chance. I knew he was coming closer and I wanted some recording of what was happening. That brings us to today. Typically I keep all of my windows closed throughout the day, but I had gotten tired of the continual artificial lights and had opened the blinds of a few today. As it was growing dark, I went around all closing them all again as I took a break from writing this. That was when I saw him. The man was there, in the street in front of my house, staring up at the window. I froze mid-close when my eyes fell on him. He had something in his hand, something that the moonlight glinted off of. He smiled at me, but this time I could see every detail of it, how it looked as if someone had shoved 2 hooks at the corners of his mouth and pulled, how the skin looked ripped from even doing this motion, how he did in fact have irises, but they were so small and so black that the whites of the eyes overpowered them, how his tongue, an unhealthy yellow color, licked his teeth and lips upon sighting me. Chills ran up and down my spine, and forgetting the curtain I rushed downstairs to lock the door, then lock it again, then again. Every time I checked out the window and he still stood there, watching me do this. Then slowly he pulled the hood of the jacket he wore over so that his face was shrouded in darkness, just as when I had first seen him, but this time I could see the glint of the whites of his eyes. Quickly I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, then hurried to the bathroom upstairs and locked the door. That is now where I am, huddled on the floor as I try and type this ending. I want to get this out. I want someone to know what happened and why. I have called the police, told them there was an intruder. They are coming, but I don't think they will be here in time. As I typed that sentence, I heard him break a window and ransack downstairs, undoubtedly searching for me. He is now coming up the stairs. Oh gosh, I can hear him laughing, the knife scraping the wall. He is outside the door now, shaking the knob. He is taunting me, calling my name. It is starting to break. If you see this, pray for me. I don't think I will survive. Story 6. My grandfather once told me about the time when he almost was a victim of a well-covered-up nationwide mass murder. My grandfather, on my father's side, was the kind of man who would be the co-owner of a huge estate but would almost lose it all because he forgot to pay the taxes on it for 3 years in a row. His father was a man who never got more than a third-grade education because of the Great Depression, and my grandmother was always struggling to find a good career against a greatly sexist population at the time. When he was first brought into the hospital for cancer, I could remember looking into his eyes and knowing that he wasn't ready to give up. He was a tough man, and loved his 3 children dearly even if maybe he wasn't the best father. When he was brought in the hospital for the 4th time for his returning cancer, there was not much more he could do. I was his youngest grandson, and his others were all juggling relationships and new careers. I loved him unconditionally, and he knew that. That's why I was the only person he trusted, upon his deathbed, with his greatest secret. I was called into his room right after my dad was, and he flashed a grim smile at me before leaving me alone with a brittled, dying man who was a shadow of his former self. With a gasp, my grandfather sighed, "Your father is a good man, but he is way too emotional for his own good. I feel you are the only person who I can confide this in, so listen carefully." Before I get into the shocking story my grandfather, Dick, told me, I have to explain that his childhood mostly contained moving all around the state of Pennsylvania. When this event happened, he was 17 and living in Scranton, the site of that TV show The Office. The rest is just his exact account of the day he almost died to what almost was this country's biggest scandal. When I was 17, my parents told me one day that I had to go get my teeth cleaned at the dentist's place in the center of town. I was living in Scranton at the time, and my dental health was horrible, to say the least. My father had long since gotten dentures, and I think he wanted me to have a better life since I didn't have to go through the depression. I guess for him, that started with a tooth cleaning. I made my way down to the dentist's office, which was marvelous compared to the rickety old shack we had in Erie. There were a lot of people who I saw laying down in chairs with tools in their mouths as I made my way to the front desk. My mother had called ahead and made an appointment, so I was able to see the doctor immediately. I remember stepping into the chair like it was yesterday. That day could have easily been my last, so help me God. The doctor looked through my mouth and told me I would need something called a root canal, or something along those lines. We didn't have much money in Scranton, and Dad was working on a factory line, so the doctor could see my face fall in disappointment. Our family hadn't even heard of insurance in those days. When the doctor told me I could get the operation with a new kind of numbing shot free of charge, I didn't know what to think at first. He could see the skepticism on my face, and told me it was completely approved by the government and being tested all over the country. The doctor, a skinny, official-looking man with a healthy mustache, assured me that it was completely safe and that I would be fine. I shouldn't have listened to that goddamn quack. Instead, I stupidly told him that I would take him up on his offer and he seemed delighted. The room was hectic as preparations were being made for the operation. Nurses were running in and out as the doctor slowly put a yellow liquid inside a syringe. I was given a device to keep my mouth in place. The doctor notified me that the syringe was almost done and it would hurt quite a bit. I would have died if not for what happened next. Before I could respond to the doctor, I could hear screams from the front desk and men in black suits sprinted into the room, knocking the needle out of the doctor's hand and pushing me out of the room. I could hear deep sighs as men in suits and sunglasses dragged other patients out of other rooms and threw them on the floor. Certain patients were injected with what looked like more than lethal doses of morphine. There were screams and cries from all over the building. Panic set in and I tried to run out of this hellish landscape, but I was knocked unconscious with one blow from a man in a suit. I woke up in a chair, heavily restrained and seated across what looked like a politician. He calmly but firmly said, "We saved your life. The paper in front of you is a silence agreement with the United States government. All we need from you is your signature." Whatever this guy's motive was, my signature was definitely more needed than desired, and I could tell from the muscular men around me that it could be beaten out of me if need be. I quickly scanned over the document and saw things like absolute silence and tragedy, and worst of all, punishable by death. My restraints were loose enough that I could get the pen the man was handing me and sign the agreement. I was quickly brought out of the room and escorted from the building back to the city of Scranton by unmarked car. Soon after, there was a piece in the local paper about many mysterious deaths happening in small towns all around the state, especially Scranton. My father caught wind of similar things happening in small towns all over the country, but I found it odd that nothing was reported in Philadelphia, or other major cities. I realized a few days later that our government knew this new anesthesia was probably unsafe, and only tested it on small cities to avoid a larger scandal. I never trusted this government from that goddamn day on, and I thank the Lord they didn't ship me over to Japan, or who knows what would have happened to me. You listen to me now, boy, I don't think you should trust our government. Bring your Aunt Allison in here when you get a chance. I sat there, dumbfounded by what I had just heard. I walked out, got Allison, and thought about my grandfather's story for a very long time. Luckily for me, I had decided to write it down. He died 3 days later than the day he told me his story. The doctors said his last words before he was put under for a surgery that ended up being fatal were, "At least I lived this long." I don't know if there's any more evidence of the tragedy he described to me, but I trust my grandfather completely. So take it from me on his behalf, be careful of these new FDA-approved medical treatments, they may not be nearly as safe as you may think. Story 7, do not trip with people you don't know very well. I was 21 years old, female, and I had just moved to Seattle, Washington. I was settling into my new apartment with a roommate I met on Craigslist. Let's call her Lisa. She was very nice, kind of the hippie type. One evening 2 weeks after I moved in, she told me she was inviting some friends over and that they were bringing some LSD. I had done it a couple of times in high school and it was my night off from my job waiting tables, so I figured why not? Her friends arrived a couple of hours later, 3 of them. Joshua, Charlie, and Lucille. We all had dinner and took our tabs. I took one, they all took 2, shortly after. For the first couple hours, everything went fine. We were all listening to EDM and watching videos of crazy light shows on YouTube. I had to go to the bathroom, so I excused myself. Upon returning, I noticed the whole vibe of the room had changed. Lucille had begun lighting candles and they had put on some calm, soothing music. I figured this was their idea of convening and having a nice time together, maybe some hippie meditation stuff I wasn't familiar with. They all turned to look at me. Despite the calm environment, their faces suggested that they had been talking about something pretty heavy while I was in the bathroom. I became uneasy with the way they were looking at me, and I asked what had happened. Nothing, it's all good, come sit. Lisa smiled at me and reached her hand out, motioning me towards the couch. I sat down. All of a sudden, my stomach began to feel queasy. I became aware that Joshua and Charlie were standing in the corner whispering about something. I don't feel well. I'm headed outside for a breather, I said in a mousy tone. Lie down. Everything is okay. You're safe now. Lucille turned towards me and I noticed her eyes had become black holes. I got up from the couch and began backing away. Charlie and Joshua inched in on me, and before I knew it, they were all surrounding me. Well, now that the mood's set up, let's have some fun. Charlie grinned at me, stepping closer to me and handing me a red robe. What the fuck is this? I tried to sound threatening and like I meant business, but I knew I sounded terrified. Join us. No. I kicked Charlie in the nuts and ran past him to the door. The door was locked and my key was in the other room. Please just give me my keys, I begged, whimpering. I'm afraid you've come too far to leave. Joshua pulled a cross off the wall and began walking towards me with it. Please, please, I beg you to stop. I just want to go outside for some fresh air and then I'll be fine. Please let me, I cried. I fell to the ground and curled up in a fetal position. I passed out. The next thing I remember is waking up in my bed with Lisa bringing me a glass of water. You totally tripped out last night, are you okay? Lisa seemed relieved that I was now responsive. The people who were here, where are they? They left. They were all concerned about you, though. We were all watching YouTube videos and we looked over at you and you were slumped over on the couch. I know this wasn't the case. And I am currently packing my things to go home to my parents, because I made a grave mistake. Do not trip with people you don't know very well. Story 8, The Shadow from the Woods. When my wife and I first moved into the house on my parents' property, the woods surrounding it were inviting and beautiful. The house itself was planted about a quarter mile from a narrow county road, connected by an old gravel driveway mostly grown up with weeds. Large, powerful trees pressed against the driveway on both sides, and the woods beyond on either side of the home were too thick to see into more than a few yards distance. If you've ever lived in or traveled through the piney woods region of East Texas, you know just how dense the foliage becomes when untended. My parents' property was squarely in the center of more than 4,000 acres of forest, and the nearest neighbor was far enough away that you could scarcely hear a gunshot from one home to the next. Needless to say, we were secluded. My parents had divorced and left the property mostly up for grabs between the kids, so my wife and I had elected to claim the old house. It was a fixer-upper, to say the least, but we were young and energetic and relished a project. Our dogs had room to run and explore, and we had our sights set on a bright future. I worked from home as a remote copywriter, my wife worked on remodeling the place. For the first few months, our lives were dreamlike, simple, even fun. I know now I should have taken my wife's first concerns more seriously. One morning, she asked if I could install a security camera in the house. She said she had been waking up in the middle of the night mid-conversation, as if answering someone's questions. She could feel someone's presence, but once she sat up and looked around the room, there was no one there. Just our sleeping dogs and the whine of our old air conditioner. When I asked if she remembered what she had been saying, she shook her head, a distant look in her eye. I told her she was talking in her sleep. I told her about the night terrors I had when I was a child, about how my sister would talk all night in her sleep in the next room. I told her about my brother's sleepwalking, waking me up as he lingered near the foot of my bed holding his stuffed animal, staring straight at the wall. Speaking to someone who wasn't there while asleep was nothing unusual, nothing to be scared of. Besides, the dogs weren't barking when she woke, were they? Still, she would occasionally suggest leaving a laptop on at night, webcam on, facing her side of the bed. Maybe if we'd done this we would have understood more about what was happening to us. Maybe I would have been able to prevent what happened later. One of the more frustrating aspects of our time spent in the house was the windows. The home had clearly been built by someone with only a rudimentary knowledge of construction because the windows were all wrong. Each window was sized differently from the next, making it next to impossible to find the right mini blinds, so half the windows in the house were bare. We went to great lengths to find the right sizes for our bedroom, but the office, kitchen, and living room were all clearly visible from the outside. We were out in the middle of nowhere, though. I chose to look at the uncovered windows as a blessing. I could see any wild animal creeping around outside before it dug through our trash cans or disturbed our dogs. I tended toward optimism whenever possible. But the night that I woke to find my wife missing from her place in the bed beside me changed the wiring of my brain completely. I sleepily called out her name. The bathroom was in the hallway just around the corner, so she should have been able to hear my voice through the wall. No response. Reluctantly, I slipped on my house shoes and got out of bed. The dogs were awake, sitting still at the foot of the bed, watching me move with curious eyes. "Where'd she go, guys?" I asked them playfully. The French bulldog tilted his head sideways, as if to shrug. I walked down the hallway and saw moonlight spilling in from the living room. The bathroom light was off, but upon turning it on I found it empty. The kitchen equally so. I moved into the living room without turning on the light and called her name again. Still no response. I could see well enough from the bright blue-gray light from outside that she was not sitting on the couch or recliner. My heart started thumping hard in my chest. My subconscious put together what my half-wakeful mind was too slow to realize: she was not in the house. I turned around in a circle on the living room floor and caught a glimpse of something outside the window, outlined in stark contrast by the moonlight. A human shape, no, two human shapes, at the edge of the woods. I ran to the door and threw it open, but before I shouted my wife's name, I heard her voice. She was laughing, chatting in an intimate way, as if with me or some old friend. "No, he's all by himself in there now, silly. We're out here. Should we go back in now? It's so cold." I could see the back of her, see the blue of her pajama bottoms and the white shirt she wore to bed. But the shape in front of her was all darkness, and as I stared harder, it slunk away into the woods. "Where are you going?" she said. The figure said nothing or spoke too quietly for me to hear its response. Then my wife screamed. It was a horrible sound, part terror, part confusion. She screamed my name, dropped to her knees, then scrambled backward away from the woods. I ran to her and grabbed her by the shoulders. "I'm here." "What? But where? Why am I outside? What's going on?" She was frantic. I could feel her whole body quivering in fear. "Who were you talking to?" I demanded. "What do you mean?" She sobbed. Slowly, I pulled her to her feet. Her knees were so weak they nearly buckled beneath her. I took in a deep breath and smelled something rancid, like ground meat forgotten in a hot car. It was so powerful I gagged, my eyes watering. "What is that?" My wife shook her head and begged me to take her inside. I faced the woods the entire time, never letting the inky blackness only a few feet within from my sight until we were safely back in the house. I ran to the office where I kept my 12-gauge shotgun, loaded it with shells, and went back to my wife in the kitchen. I told her I didn't know what was going on, but if whoever that was came back, I'd shoot. I'd never shot anything in my life other than targets, but I was too panicked to think of a better plan. My wife sat at our kitchen table, her head in her hands. She was shaking, rocking back and forth slightly. She told me she didn't remember getting out of bed, didn't remember going outside. She had woken up talking, staring at a black shape that disappeared into the woods before her eyes. I told her I had seen it too. We should have left immediately. We should have stashed our valuables, secured the dogs in the back seat of the car, and gotten out of there before daybreak. But we didn't. We stayed, comforted by the safety lent by the shotgun. I told my wife I would file a police report. I would tell them that someone had tried to kidnap her in the middle of the night. I would buy motion-activated floodlights, security cameras, more guns, the works. She agreed to every suggestion. They were good ideas. We would be safe now, she told me. There was nothing else to worry about. In the morning, I drove to the police station. I told them what had happened. They seemed appropriately concerned and promised they'd send someone out to search the area. When they did that evening, it was only one cop and a German shepherd. They prowled the perimeter of the property for an hour or so, asking questions about what the guy had looked like, sounded like. But my wife had no real answers. She made the mistake of telling the cop she'd been sleepwalking, something I had left out of the initial report. The cop was visibly annoyed, but pretended to take the rest of his time on our property seriously. He plainly thought we were full of shit after that and left within the hour, promising to follow up with us in a few days. He recommended motion-activated floodlights, security cameras, and more guns. That night, we went to sleep very late. My wife couldn't sleep. I was dead tired, but I knew she was terrified of falling asleep and waking up somewhere else. I made sure the doors and windows were locked, put the kitchen table and chairs in front of them to stop even the cleverest sleepwalker from navigating past them, and got into bed. I ran my fingers through my wife's hair until I heard the telltale breathing of someone sound asleep. I followed suit shortly after, and then I started talking. It was an easy conversation, like catching up with an old friend or past lover. I was happy to share my thoughts, to answer their questions. And I was compelled to follow them. When I came to, I was in the middle of the woods. Deep, far past anything I recognized. I was no longer on our property. The sun was not yet up, but there was a pale morning light illuminating the tree limbs around me. I was in the center of a crowd of brambles, barefoot, shirtless. I was shivering with the cold, clutching the gooseflesh on my arms. and finishing a sentence, "But it's okay if you want to take her with you." The crashing wave of mortal terror I felt then is something I believe very few humans experience. How is the waking brain supposed to make sense of unexpectedly finding itself somewhere it didn't fall asleep, coupled with the knowing that something lured you away from the safety of your bed? I started screaming, wordless. I looked all around for the shadow, the dark figure my wife had spoken with the night before. I knew it would take hold of me at any moment, sink its teeth into me, and exhale that hot, rancid breath down the back of my neck. But I was alone. My toes had sunken down into dewy pine needles and the mulch beneath. My feet, ankles, and shins were a tatter of cuts and scrapes from countless vines whipping at me as I was pulled into these woods away from my wife. My wife. I had to get back to her. I had to see she was still in bed, still safe in our home. This time it had come for me instead. This time it was me that had been pulled outside, but I was still alive. Then I ran as fast as I could, ignoring the thorns tearing at my bare skin. I slammed into the trees in the dim light, propelling myself forward with bruising palms. The direction I took felt right. I would get back home, and we would leave these woods forever. My voice was rapidly going hoarse from shouting my wife's name. I ran up a hill and was totally out of breath by the time I reached the top. I spun round, trying to make sense of where I was. I would find my way back, I would see something I recognized. Then I heard a dog barking. My wife's dog, her French bulldog. It was faint, but I could easily make out which direction it was coming from. Out of breath or not, I ran. After what felt like an hour, with the sun finally rising through the trees, I could see a clearing ahead. I could even make out the color and shape of our house poking out from the woods. But the closer I got, the stronger I felt a sensation I could not quite place, somewhere between fear and a grim certainty of what I would find. Something was wrong. Why were the dogs outside? I could hear them all barking now, probably at my pounding footfalls as I drew nearer. Why had my wife not heard me screaming? I reached the barbed wire fence that separated our property line from the woods. I tried to climb over it, using a fence post to support my weight, but fell to the other side, my right arm catching awkwardly in the wire. Mangled or otherwise, I yanked it away and charged to the house, ignoring the screeching pain caused by the sharp gravel beneath my feet. The front door was wide open. The dogs barked madly at the sight of me, running toward them covered in dirt and blood and shouting mindlessly. They were mortified and scrambled away from me. I saw nothing through the windows, no lights. No one awake inside, just my ludicrous reflection, half naked and wild. I ran through the open door, calling my wife's name again and again, hoping, pleading that she would answer. But she didn't. She was not in the house. I searched every inch of the property, straining my vocal cords to their limit with my cries, but still she gave no answer. Eventually I collapsed against the outside wall of the house, struggling for breath, ignoring the pungent odor of rotted flesh. My 12-gauge lay on the ground a few feet away, its barrel bent at a 90-degree angle. I coughed and wheezed in a manic laughter. My vision grew hazy, and black shadows crept into the corners of my eyes. No matter how hard I fought, I couldn't stay awake. My wife's dog licked the wounds on my legs and arms as I slipped out of consciousness. And when the conversation started again, it was like picking up right where we left off. Story 9, first post, my paranormal experience 19 years ago. Hi all. This is my first post and first real foray into anything like this. Having watched several videos on YouTube recently, I've been inspired to share my own paranormal experiences on this kind of platform. Anyway, it was 1999 and I was a few months into a new secondary school in my hometown in the UK. I walked home from school one Friday night with a guy called Chris who lived near me and was in several of my classes. Chris was a popular guy and we shared a lot of interests and soon became very good friends. One of our main interests at the time was WWF and Chris invited me round to stay at his house one Friday night to watch the wrestling, watch films and play games etc. I had heard rumors from people at school that Chris's family were very wealthy, so wasn't at all surprised when I first saw his house. It was very big in a quiet, leafy area of the village. Straight away though, for some bizarre reason, the house gave me a really bad feeling before I had even entered. The best way to describe the inside was that of a house you'd see in a movie, big with plenty of corridors and rooms. I had a feeling of dread whenever I entered the house, but I wasn't sure why. I shared my feelings with Chris, not sure how he would respond, but he understood where I was coming from. He went on to tell me several stories about seeing things in the house and having shadowy figures chase him, but I couldn't take him seriously. Chris was into horror movies and had a tendency to over-exaggerate. Several months went by and I wasn't spending as much time with Chris. Partly down to us spending time with others' friends, playing sports etc. But then a new WWF video game was released and we soon got together again and I started to visit his house. While playing the game for hours on end, Chris told me that he'd been having a reoccurring nightmare about a shadowy figure chasing around his house. I didn't take much notice of what he was saying at the time as I was more interested in the game. Not long after that, Chris had several weeks off school due to an illness. I tried calling him but got no answer, so I backed off. When he finally returned to school, he seemed quite fragile, so I kept my distance. I never found out the real reason he was off school. One Saturday night a few months later, I received a random phone call from Chris asking if I wanted to stay over his and hang out. I had no plans, so I agreed and went over. The feeling of dread and unease soon returned as I walked into his house. It was worse than ever. I really didn't want to be there, but I couldn't really leave having agreed to stay over. Chris had been acting very bizarre at school, having more time off and generally antagonizing people. I thought I'd use the situation to rekindle our friendship, as uncomfortable as I felt. This particular evening, Chris was home alone. His parents and his sister were out of the house and we were upstairs in his bedroom playing Monopoly. It was pretty strange for two teenage lads to be playing a board game at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night, but as I remember, we were extremely bored. We'd managed to make a right mess in his room. There was money and cards and pieces all over the floor. The box was open and the board was on the bedroom floor where we were sat playing. Still home alone, the phone in his parents' bedroom rang at around midnight. Chris left the room to answer it and I followed him down the corridor, his parents' bedroom. It was his mum calling, saying that she and her dad were on their way home and his sister was staying round a friend's house that night. The phone call lasted less than 3 minutes and we soon headed back to Chris's bedroom. I entered first and was shocked to see that the Monopoly board, the pieces, the money and all the cards had disappeared from the bedroom floor. We had left the room less than 5 minutes before and the room was in a total mess. Now it was completely spotless and immaculate. "What the fuck?" I said and turned to Chris, who was speechless and looked blankly at the room. I then checked under the bed where we had got the game from originally, and there it was, the box and everything packed orderly inside, like it had never been played with before. I was pissed off and wanted to get out of that house straight away. I was convinced Chris was playing tricks on me, but he was adamant that he had had nothing to do with it. He seemed genuine, and for a few minutes we sat and looked at each other in complete horror at how this could have happened. We had only left the room for a few minutes, we were home alone. What or who could have possibly tidied his bedroom in that time, and why? That was the last time I went to Chris's house, and he and his family moved a year or so after that. We grew further apart as the years went on, developing different interests. I was convinced for a long time that Chris had set me up that night, trying to spook me, and it had worked to a point. He has always denied doing that though, and even denied it when we bumped into each other several years ago. I'm not sure if Chris's nightmares and stories could be linked to what happened that night, but I know for sure that whenever I entered that house, from the first time to the last, I had a feeling of pure terror come over me, and it's a feeling I'll never forget. MC. Story 10, Hang Up. 1. I guess I'd better start where it began. At a yard sale. I was driving home from work, and I saw a young couple with a few tables and bunch of random crap on said tables. I still don't see why I did it. Maybe it was the lady who put $5 in the tip jar, and I had a little cash to spend. Maybe it was because everything was damn near dirt cheap. Maybe I was just looking for trouble, because I sure as hell got some. I walked to the tables and just greeted them normally. They seemed really energetic and happy, which I guess rubbed off on me a bit. I was a sweaty mess, still wearing my subway apron along with my muddy sneakers and Brenner name tag. I got one item, a payphone. No, this wasn't a plastic novelty one. This was a real payphone. I could see the hole where it was ripped from the stand. The former owners were willing to part with it, though one of them lingered when they grabbed it for me before her friend took it himself. I don't know why this girl, or anyone, for that matter, would want something like this as a decoration unless you were a total hipster who thinks any rusted piece of metal is vintage. Anyways, I took it back to my house and set it on my kitchen table. It was a bit too oxidized for my tastes, so I took off the rust and even touched up the paint on where it had been chipped. I was actually pretty proud of myself considering how well I'd fixed it. Then I had an idea. What if I put a coin in there, just for shits and giggles? I picked up the phone as I rummaged through my bag for my leftover change from the tips that day. I hadn't even gotten a chance to find some coins. On the other line, a deep, raspy voice cackled, and in the background there was a crackling noise, like a campfire. The disembodied laugh resonated through my whole house. My dog started to whimper. I was pretty freaked out by that, but it only got worse. I dropped the phone. The handle was red hot. Then some semi-clear, pinkish liquid began to drip out of the holes the sound travels for the ear and mouth. The last thing I remember before I blacked out was looking at my burnt hand. There were blisters and boils covering my palm, and a few were popping and oozing pus. Then falling backwards. I woke up in my bed to my mom bringing me some hot tea. "Brenner, I made you some tea after you fainted. Are you feeling okay, sweets?" I breathed a sigh of relief. It was all a weird, crazy dream. I tried to prop myself up on my bed. And my left hand recoiled as I felt a stinging pain on my palm. "Sweets, you probably burnt your hand on the stove burner. When I came in you were unconscious." I looked at my hand, red and peeling, but no boils. No pus. The relief washed over me. I figured it was a hallucination caused maybe by mold on food or something. After assuring my mom that I was strong enough to go down the stairs, I put a bagel in the toaster. I walked over to the payphone cautiously. I tapped the handle quickly. And it was cold. There was no sign of any burning on the phone handle. I felt the weights on my chest fall. Then I felt my sock dampen. It was the liquid that had come out of the phone. A small puddle had formed next to the table. And I just stepped in it. Ding. My bagel that had gone forgotten for a minute pulled me back to reality. The charred, blackened bagel that sat in my toaster oven had become the least of my worries. Dash 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 dash. I'm terrified right now. However, I've decided to figure this out. I need answers about this damn payphone. I'm mainly thinking of finding what that liquid was, though right now I'm pretty sure I know what it is. I'll keep you guys updated once I get answers. Brenner less than 3. Story 11, Sleep paralysis made me remember something I never really wanted to remember. I recently had sleep paralysis the other night. During my paralysis there was a giant black mass standing near my closet, watching me while I laid in bed all throughout the night. The next morning I remembered about the dream, which made me remember about something that happened to me when I was a small child. I'm not very good at explaining in full detail, so please bear with me as this was 13 years ago. I'll try to remember as much as I can. When I was around 5 years old, I used to be terrified of going to sleep. I would scream and cry until I was allowed to sleep with the lights on or in my parents' bed. I just couldn't stand having something stare at me from the closet. Every night, this thing would open my closet door just enough for its hand to reach out, and would try to finger motion for me to go near it. I don't know what it wanted with me, but I just know that the figure seemed so eager to have me go into the closet with it. It had gotten so bad and traumatizing for me over the next few nights that my dad put a picture of Jesus above my closet to see if that would help me go to sleep. The Jesus picture only made it worse. I wasn't able to sleep in my room at all anymore. Each night this figure would slowly open the closet wider and wider, trying to show itself to me. My dad would get angry and scream at me because I was apparently too old at that age to be sleeping with the lights on. Because of him saying that about the lights being on, he was especially angry with me sleeping in his bed. Sleeping out of my room at night didn't last very long, so I had no choice but to sleep alone in the dark. One night the figure fully opened my closet door, stepped out halfway and whispered to me in such a calming voice. I remember it said that everything will be alright and to come follow him. I didn't know any better. I got up out of bed, took its hand as it led me out of my room, through the living room and out the front door into my dad's shed. After this thing took me into the shed, it backed away from me, walked backwards into the corner of the shed, disappearing into the darkness. A couple of minutes passed by of me just staring at the corner of the shed when I got a really terrified, cold feeling. This made me scream bloody murder for my parents. As I kept screaming and jumping up to look out of the shed window, I saw the outside lights turn on, my parents rush out of the house and rush to the shed door to get me out. When they carried me out and brought me back inside the house, they were freaking out about how I got in there. This was because in order for them to even get to me, they had to turn the house alarm off, unlock the front door and unlock the shed door. I can't remember what exactly happened, but I do remember that after that night, the shadow figure never showed up again. I'm 18 now. I asked my parents earlier today if they remember anything from that night, but they don't. They both think that I'm telling them a story I read, which is really frustrating for me. It was like that memory was wiped clean from their brains. It's the only, truly scary memory for me, and it's like it never even happened. Story 12. Being a magician is going to kill me. Yesterday was the most horrifying day in my life. I'm not sure where to go from here. I hope that this works out. If it doesn't, then I hope that this is seen. An explanation to our disappearances will hopefully be helpful. I am a fifth-rate magician, but I am looking to get in practice so I can try and make a run of it as a profession. I know that this is not the best choice of careers. Most people can barely name a handful of magicians, and most of them only because they are able to push long metal objects through their faces. That is not the thing that interests me. I am more interested in the classic world of magic. The top hats, the sawing a lady in half, the things that most newer magicians would frown upon. I was hired to work at a college lock-in. That, as most of my jobs did not go well. I can't keep the overstimulated attention of a late teen for more than a few seconds. I used to have this idea that I could capture anyone's attention. But it is hard to compete with the world of instant and overpopulated media and entertainment. I am doing one of my card tricks and I noticed one girl watching very closely at everything I was doing. She seemed to be studying me. After I had finished the trick and basked in my half-hearted applause, I walked over to her. "Would you like to see a trick?" I asked her, not knowing how this was going to go. She replied in a soft and kind voice. "That's not how I would have done it." Her face was calm and still. "Oh, are you a magician?" I replied, thinking maybe I could teach her something or maybe learn something. "Not in the sense that you are. I have studied old magic." Her gaze changed and she looked up at me with fierce emotion in her eyes but with the same calm look on her face. This wasn't the first time that I had one of these nut jobs come up and talk to me. Magicians often deal with people that have loved the idea of witchcraft and the occult. I see. Well, I should really keep working, so if you don't want to see anything I am going to move on. This was the nicest and quickest response I have come up with for dealing with this. Usually it seems to get me away with just a scoff from the person. I start to walk away. But I feel her grab my arm and tightly. "Read the book. From beginning to end. Try nothing until you have finished it." As she finished this sentence she walked away. I shook this encounter off and went about finishing my set so I can get out of there and go home and see Jennifer, my girlfriend. Things had been rough lately with us. She had been pushing me to get a real job and give up on the idea of being a magician, so when I am out till 2 in the morning doing magic, it adds to the slowly forming rift between us. I finally wrap up the job and get home a little after 2. The lights are out but I can see that there is still a blue hue from the TV in the living room. I grab my bag of magic props and head to the door. When I get to the front door I can see that there is a package leaning against the door. It is small and wrapped only in brown shipping paper but without writing of any kind. I grab it and head inside. I lock the door and arm the alarm system behind me. Jennifer had fallen asleep on the couch. A common occurrence when I work late. I put down my bag and the package and go and cover her up with a blanket. I turned off the TV and went to bed. The next day, I wake up to find she had made me breakfast. She is sitting at the kitchen table reading a small, leather-bound book. I walk over and kiss her on the forehead. I head to the cabinet to get a mug for some coffee. What are you reading? I asked as I continue my coffee-making ritual. I hope you don't mind, she said without looking up from the book. I saw the book next to your bag and thought I would see what it was. I didn't have a book by my bag, I respond as I walked back to the table. I pulled up my chair and look more intently at the book she is reading. It is a dark brown leather with some gold inlay, no title or words on the outside. Well, it's really interesting, Jennifer said. I think I am understanding why you like this magic stuff so much. It puts it in a really interesting way in here. I had no idea how much was involved. Still confused, I listened. Look, I feel like I can try something already and I've only read a few pages. With this she stands up and gets on top of the chair that she was sitting on. She picks up the knife that was sitting next to her bagel. She wraps her hand around the blade and pulls hard. What the fuck are you doing? I screamed as loud as I could. Blood is pouring from her hand. It is pooling around her feet on the chair. She looks back over to me with huge amounts of fear and pain in her eyes. I thought that would work. She started to cry. She looked down at the book still open on the table. I must have missed something. I must have. Still holding the knife, she does it again, but this time she screams in pain as the blade pulls through her hand. As the knife clears, she said something I didn't understand and followed that with a louder scream. In all my life, I had never heard a scream like this. It hurt my ears and made it so I had to close my eyes from the pain. Then there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just silence. I opened my eyes, and she was gone. The only thing left was the pool of blood on her chair. I wanted to call the police, but I have no idea what happened. No one would believe any of this. I knew I needed to read the book and figure out what was happening, but it wasn't there either. I cleaned up the blood. It is after midnight when I decided to go to bed. I took a sleeping pill to help calm my nerves. Reluctantly I gave way to the drowsiness and fell asleep. I shot up when I heard the boom. It was unnaturally loud. I walked through the house, I saw nothing. The doors are locked, the alarm is set, I am fine. The sleeping pill was powerful. I laid back in bed. Even with the adrenaline I am able to calm myself quickly. I wasn't asleep for more than a few minutes when it happened again. Again, I checked everything and again I went back to bed. The most recent time this happened I woke up and couldn't breathe. I could feel my life being smothered out of me. I could feel my body giving up and accepting its demise. Right when I felt as though it is almost over, the pillow is pulled from my face. It was Jennifer. She is covered in blood. She stares at me, blood dripping off of her onto me. A blank look on her face but death in her eyes. She leans down to my ear and whispers, "Death comes to those who don't heed the warning." I closed my eyes tight and waited to die. When nothing else happened, I opened them. She is gone again. That was about 4 hours ago. I am up now, afraid to go back to sleep. Tomorrow I am going to go back to the college and find that girl. Hopefully I can fix this. Story 13, someone came in my house. It's 8:23 p.m. As this unfolds, I'll do my best to document everything. With any luck, I'll be able to post it to r/nosleep as soon as it's over. Before I get too deep into what's happening, there are a few things you should know. My name is Kenneth, I'm in my 30s. I live alone in a remote location, at least 2 miles from my closest neighbor in all directions. My small house, more of a cabin, sits at the end of a curvy, quarter-mile-long gravel driveway. Looking inside from my front door, there's a living/sitting area to the left. My kitchen is to the right, and there's a short hallway down the center. Off the right of the hallway is my bedroom. Across from that on the left side is a small guest room that I've been using for my hobbies. At the end of the hall is the only bathroom. That's it. Pray for me. 8:26 p.m. The knocking has gone on for a solid 3 minutes. All the lights are off in the hope that whoever's on my porch assumes no one's home and moves on. I'm hiding behind the shower curtain in the tub of my bathroom. The slow, dull thud on my front door has persisted, as if to a metronome. In this case, it's like a drowsy drummer kicking the bass drum in perfect time. The cadence of it is eerie. I'm far from the closest town, no one should be here. My heart is racing. 8:30 p.m. The pounding stopped about a minute ago. With optimism guiding my actions, I'm pulling back the shower curtain. My place has decades-old wood flooring that will creak deep into anyone's eardrum if so much as a mouse walks across it. I've arrived to the end of the hall. Tiptoeing, I made my way without any audible groans from the slabs of oak beneath my bare feet. I am crouched, hugging the right side wall, and facing the front door. I can still hear something pacing. I'll wait here for another minute or so. 8:32 p.m. The pacing went on until now. A figure crossed by the window to my left of the front door. It stood, unflinching, casting a long shadow into the kitchen. Then it moved to my right, disappearing behind the door. The banging has begun again, this time, with furious desperation. It startled me, causing my balance to shift away from the balls of my feet. I fell backward and landed against the aged wood with a thunderous, echoing slam. The beating on the door stopped. Nothing. I've clambered back to my feet. Silence. Whoever or whatever is out there, now knows I'm inside. My dread feels as though it's giving way to shock. I'm paralyzed with anxiety. Then I hear it. The sound of a gentle whimper swelling to a panicked sob. This has to be someone seeking help. God, I hope it is. I'm starting for the door. 8:36 p.m. Fearful of what could happen if I did open the door, I hesitated and then retreated back to the tub. I'm again peeking out at the front door from behind the black and tan striped curtain hanging in front of me. The sobbing, now combined with the loudest wallops yet, is giving me full body shivers. 8:38 p.m. It's all stopped again. No sound. No pacing. No weeping. No banging. I'm still in the tub, crouched again, concentrating on any sounds. Nothing. It's been quiet for a couple minutes. I hope it's over. But as I stood, the hairs on the back of my neck rose to attention, and my forearms became blanketed in goosebumps. I hear footsteps inside. I'm freezing to my core, my heart is pulsing out of my chest, and my breathing is picking up. How could they get in here without me noticing? I glanced out again. I can see the silhouette of a dark figure stumbling around toward the sitting area. If I stay here, I'm a sitting duck for whatever might be in store for me. I have no weapons, other than a drawer full of kitchen knives. Making a dash for that drawer might be the only chance I have. 8:41 p.m. I'm going for it. After this, if I'm able to continue documenting, it'll be for events that have already occurred. I made it to the knife before anything could have known I was there. Once I had a firm grip on the blade's hickory handle, I spun around to face them. It was her. A young, lone female. She's battered, muddy and had a trickle of dried blood streaking down her cheek from a cut above her right temple. She'd broke her nose and was missing a shoe. She started toward me, staggering from 15 feet away. I called out, "Stop where you are." She did so, wavering in place. "Dizzied. What happened to you?" I asked. Through snivels and stammers, she responded, I was in an accident." Keeping her distance, she went on to detail the crash. She swerved to miss a deer, sending her car careening into the ravine across the road from my property. She made the climb up and out of the ravine, where she happened to see a reflection of the full moon off my tail lights. Through the woods and all the way from the road, somehow. Impressive, I suppose. She made the trek, bloodied and disoriented, to my door. Please help me, mister. Please. I think. I hit my head. The words seeped out from between her lips. It was clear she did not comprehend the severity of her situation. I turned on the kitchen light, a single golden bulb flickered on and shone down. She started shuffling toward me. She wouldn't endure much longer before losing consciousness. I met her halfway and grabbed her around the waist, allowing her to slump back into the fold of my left arm. I patted her cheek, pleading for her to remain awake. It was important that she stayed conscious. She lifted her tired eyelids, moaning in agony but trying her best. She regained an upright posture, hunched though it was, and saw me in the light. We were now facing one another, our eyes locked. She managed a crooked smile through the puffiness of her swollen face and said, "Thank you." I began to smile. The smiling turned into a giggle, then the giggle into hysterical laughter. My cackling must have seemed demented to her confused mind. Or not. It didn't matter. I slid the large butcher knife into the center of her abdomen. I cannot stress this enough, she had to be awake. This was the exact second my unease dissipated and turned to joy. Blissful solace washed over me in steady, warm waves. It seemed to go on forever. Her eyes widened, bulging from their sockets, and she gasped. The gasp, as it always does, quickly became a shriek. With my left hand still resting on the small of her back, I pushed hard to the right, beneath her rib cage. This forced the 9-inch blade to exit through her side, leaving a large laceration from front to back and through. I won't lie, I had to do some light sawing. She stumbled toward the door, grabbing at the gash, unaware of the pinkish granite oozing from it. I circled her, making sure she never reached the door. She turned and hobbled down the hallway and into the bathroom, where she slammed the door behind her. Her screams were desperate and frantic. In 6 or 7 large stride steps, I was there. I tapped on the door with the spine of my blood-smeared knife. Her screeching intensified. There is no window in my bathroom, giving her no place left to go. No way out. It felt best to menace her. "Hey now, what's the matter?" I chuckled and continued. "My name's Kenny. I want to thank you. It's been 5 months since I've been able to fulfill my needs. You see, if you pay for a decent enough defense attorney, you're buying off the legal system. I'm accused of killing 4 girls, each about your age. Wouldn't you know it, all the evidence is circumstantial. Do you know why? Because I'm a spectacular fucking killer. Efficient, careful, thorough. They'll never find anything to connect me to those murders. Or my 7 others. They can't indict. My lawyer was able to convince the judge to hold me on house arrest. Only while the investigation is ongoing, mind you. I can't leave the confines of this property. Beyond the porch, this bracelet around my ankle will start to beep. The LEDs will flash, the beeps will hasten and I'll only have seconds to get back within the perimeter. But you came to me. Believe it or not, I wished you would go away, leave before encountering me. That all changed when you got inside. From the second I knew you were in my living room, my adrenaline, along with my bloodlust, soared. Slipping this knife into you was beautiful. You get to sleep now and never wake up again. Doesn't that sound peaceful? Doesn't that sound wonderful? Of course, I didn't expect a response. By now, the revelation that she can see the contents of her stomach has sent her spiraling into madness. She knows she's going to die. Her already labored breathing had grown into long, shallow breaths. I could hear the blood rising into her throat. The gurgling sound was gratifying. It always is. I'm upset that I couldn't see the final seconds, or of the death throes that followed. I've seen it enough to know, and in this moment feel, the satisfaction it brings. After a few more minutes, she stopped gasping for air, made one final growl for life, and it was over. I took my time removing the doorknob. No rush now. Once inside, I saw her, splayed in the tub. She was so sweet to think of my long night of sanitizing ahead and assist with clean up. Thanks for falling backward into my bathtub. I soaked up what I could of the blood trail she left behind from the kitchen, and burned everything else. She's resting on the table in my hobby room. Now the real fun begins. Thank God someone came in my house. Story 14, Go away. Go away, it said. That was odd. Why not go away? Why contract the word like that? Why say it at all? I worked for a major insurance company dealing with the notification of new claims. A customer had called, after a breakdown, and needed their vehicle picking up. It was my job, God I hated that job, to arrange the collection of vehicle. I had just called the sister company to arrange this when, instead of the usual corporate greeting and endless how's your morning/weekend/day going and not so bad, be better at 5 hair banter, the caller said go away. Perhaps it was just someone who hates work, maybe some kid who had just started. Damn it, I still had the customer on hold. Go away has disrupted my routine. After releasing the customer, I had to work my break to have their car recovered and stop a complaint. It is annoying to worry about keeping a job you hate. As a result of missing my break, I was irritable and I still had 5 long, slow, endless hours left. I also missed seeing my pal, who owed me a tenner. Anyway, home was hours away. Hours which felt endless. I felt like I could see them marching off into the distance forever and ever. I never felt time as keenly as when I worked in that call center. Lily. Oh God, what now? My call had been checked for quality assurance and I had failed. QA hadn't heard the go away, only someone waiting for me to respond. Strange. Maybe I hadn't heard it. If it wasn't for that weird call, my day would be fine. Now everything is slightly less fine. I had never liked QA people, but this one was weird. He wouldn't look me in the eye and kept hesitating. Maybe someone who knew they were screwing me. The day continued in the same vein. Lots of mild inconveniences stemming from that strange call. I felt uneasy. Why did QA not hear it? I decided to go kill time by going to the loo. It was eerily empty as I shut the door. Loads of people had just come out. Places which are usually so busy seem so odd when they are empty. I sat down and got my phone out. Go away. The words slithered out of the silence. Jumping up, I launched myself out of the cubicle and back to my desk. Okay, that was really weird. I looked around and noticed the office was strangely silent. I tried to catch my pal's eye and do an exaggerated boredom expression, but she wouldn't look up. For some reason, not one person was on a call. It felt wrong. I wanted to go home and do something normal. I wanted my usual routine. My stomach was crawling with anxiety. It wasn't just the weird call, it was how it had set my whole day off on a slightly different track. Eventually clocking off time came around. Thank God, something which has happened according to routine. Hastily, I turned my computer off, grabbed my coat and set off towards the lift. Hey Lil, it was my pal with the tenner. Something is working out. She dashed over, full of apologies, thrust the money in my hand and dashed off. I was too grateful for something going right that I didn't realize I hadn't spoken to anyone all day. Weird. I usually have a natter over coffee or have lunch with someone. Did I even have lunch? I really don't recall. I dismissed the thought and ran to get my buzz. I was just on time to see it sail off without me. I always get the same buzz. Always. The familiarity of seeing the same people was comforting. I would chat to my bus friend on the way home. The next bus turned up half an hour later, much quieter and empty. I sat down and looked around. No one was talking. I was sure I could hear whispering, but when I looked up, it stopped. I don't like it. With relief I reached my stop and raced through the front door. I wanted to see my partner and feel normal. Do our usual routine. She wasn't in. Because I was late home, she had gone to a friend's and had tried to tell me, but my phone had died. The house felt dead. I passed the evening alone and desperate for things to settle back on the right track. She came back around 10 and we settled for bed. I wanted to wake tomorrow to a new day where things would be back to normal. It didn't happen. A few hours later, after I woke to the feeling of being watched. My partner does sleepwalk and it always terrorizes me. She was lying next to me staring at me. No, behind me, whispering feverishly. "Wake up," I said. When she didn't, I shouted louder and instantly regretted it. She rose sideways up. How? Stared behind me and said, "Go away." Shit. I resisted the urge to turn around. In no way am I looking. The hairs pricked along my neck and arms. The darkness behind me felt full. Something was there. Something had always been there. Go away, she repeated it endlessly. Who? I asked. I didn't know what else to do. If she snapped out of it, maybe we would laugh about her weirdness and I could go back to sleep. She didn't respond. Something behind me did. I sensed movement towards me, around me, like a shroud. The air felt thick. Still I couldn't turn. I wanted to. I knew I couldn't. It watched and she stared and whispered. A darker area of black formed behind her. Why won't she wake? I realized then. She was. She had been looking right at me. Then it dawned on me. No one had spoken to me for days and she always went round to friends for tea. It had been since I had walked the dark road inside me. People had been recoiling from me for days. Now I seek and lurk in the dark. Maybe I am the dark shadow in the corner, over there, by the wardrobe. I don't know how to not be me. Please help. Edited, spelling. Story 15, Missing Memory. My memory may not be the best, but I tend to remember important events or small details of things that I find significant. I always pick up on the small things, whether it be the inflection on someone's words or a very minor detail of an event. That being said, I recently remembered a huge event that I had somehow forgotten. I moved into my first apartment last week. I got a new job and had to move 6 hours away from my home. The job and the apartment are good. Everything has been fine so far. My biggest problem has been my kitchen cabinets. I've smacked my head off the open doors too many times already. One too many times, to be exact. I think it's just the height and the positioning of the cabinets, but every time I open one, I forget to close it and proceed to smash my head off the open door. So last Saturday night, I was planning on making a cup of coffee. I reached for the cabinet, opened it, and proceeded to grab my mug. I immediately remembered that I didn't get the coffee out yet, so I quickly bent down to open the bottom cabinet and grab my coffee. Upon coming back up, my head met the cabinet with the force of 1,000 suns, or at least a force strong enough to knock me out. I thought I have always had a pretty thick head and I have never been knocked out, but that cabinet had it out for me. Apparently, I was only knocked out for 30 minutes, but when I had woken up, I was in a panic. I immediately grabbed my head, and to my relief, there was no blood. I had a huge bump though. I also was happy to see I placed my favorite mug on the counter before I reached down to get the coffee, so nothing was broken. The coffee was all over the floor though. After cleaning up, I thought about just going to bed, but since I was just knocked out, I figured I probably shouldn't. In all honesty, I should have went to the doctor for this injury, but I decided against it. I stayed up for a few more hours, and after the swelling went down some, I decided it was time to sleep. Crazy dreams are nothing new to me. I think I've consumed too much horror or violent media in my years. I'm not really complaining though, because I do enjoy the crazy dreams. It's pretty much another source of entertainment. Lots of violence and gore. Lots of strange monsters and scary settings. Although some of those dreams end up feeling real upon me waking up, I can quickly understand that they are just dreams. This changed that Saturday night. My dreams started off with me waking up in my hometown. I was in my parents' house. Everything seemed to be the same as it was years ago. In fact, when I got out of bed and looked around, everything was the same. This was the strangest feeling. I reached for my phone from my nightstand, and I was shocked to pick up an iPhone. I have recently switched to an Android, but there was no Android phone in sight. I looked at the date, 6:25 a.m. September 5, 2015. I wasn't even that shocked. A part of me knew what was happening. A part of me felt like I've been through all of this before. Then I heard the sound. It was still fairly warm outside during the day, but cold at night, so I kept my window open for the best sleeping experience. I went to my open window and listened. No birds. No bugs. Just a low, droning sound. The first thing that came to my mind was a fire alarm. Maybe someone had set one off down the street or something. It sounded more distant than down the street, though. I also heard no other sounds coming from outside. Something was off. I decided to go take a look outside. If this was 2015, I had to be at work by 8, so I had time. I threw on some clothes and I opened my door. My parents were asleep in their bed across the hall. The dogs were asleep with them. Everything seemed so normal. I went downstairs, shut off the alarm, and went outside. The smell hit me. That early morning smell of the dew and the fresh air. It was the smell that made me realize this wasn't a normal dream. This was real. This had happened before. This was a memory, not a dream. How could I have forgotten all of this though? I only began to remember as I would progress further into this dream. Piecing my memories back together through this dream was not what I was expecting to do when I went to bed on Saturday. Although I didn't remember everything, I had gut feelings. Gut feelings about where to go and what would happen. My overall feeling was not that great. Something was definitely wrong, but I didn't know what. I did know to follow the sound and find the source, though. I opened the gate to my backyard and walked down my driveway. Still no sounds other than the droning, alarm sound. I looked to the trees and saw birds lined along the branches. They looked as if they were all sleeping. That would explain the lack of noise, but the birds should be awake and lively at this hour. What is going on? I walk out to the front of my house and look down the street towards the main road. No cars driving. No noise. Instead of walking, I decided to grab my bike and ride around. This gave me a better way of escaping in case something sketchy were to happen. I started riding down my street towards the main road. I didn't even think about it. I just started pedaling. The noise became slightly clearer and louder as I progressed. I rode down the middle of the main road and still, no cars. No people. No noise other than this alarm sound and my own bike. I was starting to get really anxious. Maybe I shouldn't have come out and went back to bed instead. But then I remembered this wasn't even the present day. This was in the past. This was a memory. Was I even truly controlling myself here, or was my control just illusion? Either way, I continued on down the road and took a right down a side street. At the end of this street is one of my favorite places from my hometown. It's just a medium-sized park with a field and a nice path around it. Nothing special other than the good times I had at that park with my friends. As I continued to ride down this street, the noise became even louder. It was a constant sound with a low pitch. I can't say I've ever heard anything like this before. The first thing that came to my mind was some alien ship that crashed or something and had some device calling for help. That's the best way I can describe that sound, unnatural and not of this world. I finally reached the park and the sound had become deafeningly loud. It felt like it was piercing right into my brain, but it didn't hurt. I felt like the sound was resonating throughout my body at this point. I parked my bike at a bike stand and started walking towards the main part of the park. I took one step onto the pavement of the parking lot and I heard a thundering boom. I stopped, dead in my tracks. Thunder? A gunshot? What was that? It honestly sounded more like someone hitting a really massive drum. I took another step. Boom. Again. My footsteps. I slowly took another step. Boom. Another 2 steps. Boom boom. At this point, the noise has died down to a very low humming sound and my footsteps were making more noise than anything. I could feel each footstep resonating outward through the ground. What on earth was happening and why did I not remember all of this? I'm guessing that when I hit my head and knocked myself out, I somehow triggered something in my head, but not fully. I walked towards a light post in the park, without thought. I knew this light post. It has numbered stickers on it. 0 to 9. They're just random stickers as far as I knew. I never touched them before, but I had looked at them a few times. They weren't in a random order either, but instead just like a number pad. I never thought anything of them. I reached out to the light post and again, without thinking about it, I pressed my finger against the numbers. 41600042. Silence. Everything started to get dark, almost as if someone was slowly turning down a dimmer switch on the entire sky. It was now night time, or so it seemed. Pitch black outside. I felt a rumbling start in front of me, behind the light post. The ground was opening up and it had revealed a staircase. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. But I went forward with that wretched feeling, and proceeded to walk down the stairs into the pitch darkness. I woke up in a cold sweat. I looked around. My apartment. I grabbed my phone from my nightstand. My Android phone. 6:25 a.m. August 30, 2018. I fell back into my pillow. What was all that? It was a dream. But also not a dream. The feeling was different. That was a memory. A memory that I somehow only had gotten back after smashing my head off that cabinet. But what happened when I walked down those stairs? Why do I not remember that? I have to go back and find out. This is not normal. Not at all. I'm not the best writer by any means, but I wanted to share this story with you people. I'm actually planning on going back home soon. I have some days off work and I decided to plan a trip home. And of course, I will be home for September 5th. Is this just a coincidence? I honestly have no idea. I have no idea what any of this means, but I absolutely cannot stop thinking about it and I needed to get it out of my head and record it somewhere. I've never had any paranormal experiences or any unexplainable events happen to me, but I've always been open to the idea of strange things happening. Maybe this is my time to experience something. Either way, I will update when I find out more. I am going to put in that code into that light post and see what happens. Wish me luck. Story 16, The Noises from the Basement. Disclaimer, I'm horrible at writing, but this is all true, please enjoy. I've lived in my current house for going on 6 years, never once have I been down in my basement. My dad has only been down there twice, both times to fix the drains, which ended up flooding the basement twice. The basement had numbers of things wrong with it. Broken windows, a broken lock to the door, water damage, of course the bugs, and lack of access from inside the house. My room was above the basement, not that I minded, or thought I did. The noises started a few months ago, when I got out of school for the summer. The noises started of small, maybe things being kicked around down there. It was dismissed as the windows broken, the neighborhood cats would be seen going in and out. Then, they progressively got louder. Banging and thrashing noises would be heard. My sister would often hear these noises and come check on me, only to find out it wasn't me, ever. I told my dad. He told me that he would check down there on a day off. He eventually did and didn't seem to find anything. They seemed to stop for a week, school now approaching, taking my attention off the basement. I just didn't seem to notice the noises anymore, being very busy with the preparations with school. It was now a few nights after school had started, I had realized the noises again. I slid on my flip-flops and grabbed my bat from the closet. Walking out of my room and tracking to my backyard, where the only entry sat. I pulled of the giant wood door, turning on my flashlight. I walked down the stairs one by one. I reached the door at the bottom of the staircase, pushing the door open and turning on the light. There it sat, a giant devil star in the middle of the room. I approached it. It was in what I hope was red paint. I walked down the small hallway and opened the door to the only room down there. There sat 3 dead bodies. On the wall spelt out was, Silencio de los Cerdos. I took Spanish for 3 years so I knew this translated to, Silence of the Pigs. I screamed loud, running back of the stairs. I ran inside waking my dad and telling him to get down to the basement. I dialed the police's number and explained the best I could. When the police arrived, they were very hush-hush about everything, almost paying us no attention. The police proceeded to tell us that this was not any noises, there were people being slaughtered. The police officers proceeded to pull a bag from the storage unit in the room, it containing the weapon, gloves, and a camera. They had the ambulances take the bodies. The police took the evidence, on the way out telling us not to leave town. The next morning it was everywhere, throwing out way too much information and even showing a picture of my home. The police eventually had us come down and be interviewed. They asked me some whack-ass questions like, have I gave my address to anyone at school? Have I been romantically involved with anyone at school, a teacher more importantly? Of course both answers were no. I hated almost everyone at school because of bullying incidents, I trusted no one. Then they had me pick out of a line of people who was my teacher. Keep in mind, they still hadn't explained what the hell was going on. Once, I identified my English teacher, they let me go. I returned back to school on Friday and heard all the tea being split. My teacher was having multiple relationships with children, and then when they threatened to tell, he cut them off, literally. Oh, and the silence of the pigs thing came into the story because the code name was Pigs, you know, when they were doing acts, to keep them from being caught. They arrested him, the school literally had no clue this was going on and was sued by the families of the victims. I don't know why my house was chosen. Oh, and I still live in the house, my family is currently house hunting, but sometimes I still hear the noises from the basement. Story 17, I believe I may be cursed. And if I am, I will die before or on October the 23rd. I am a 24-year-old, British male, and I have come here in slight desperation and hope of finding an answer. You must know a few things before reading my tale. First of all, I thank you all for taking the time to read my post. I'm thanking you in advance because this might end up being a lengthy read for you. Secondly, do not mistake me for a troll. By even mentioning the word, I suppose I might be indicating that I am indeed a crank, but I assure you I am not. Even though what I'm proposing sounds fantastic, believe me when I say that what you're about to read is true. And finally, I create this post with reluctance. All my life I have been a non-believer in all things supernatural, save for my belief in God. I am not superstitious, but now I reach a point where I'm finding it harder and harder to ignore the signs that I am cursed. My story begins exactly 1 year ago. August 30, 2017. This was the date I met a lady who I would quickly fall in love with. What happened with her is in many ways inconsequential to the rest of the tale, but you must know of this because it could well be the indirect cause of my troubles. We met while I was on a summer holiday in my static caravan in North Wales. She was on a weekend holiday with some friends. Our connection was instant. I've been a, player all my life. I've never really used a woman, exactly, but I've never intended to settle down. I've never felt a spark or a buzz with a woman. I've always enjoyed a single life. But when I met her, things soon changed. Before I knew it, we were spending all our time together and making plans for the future. My emotions seemed to grow whenever I was around her. My happiness was stronger, and I felt pain much deeper. We were nearly 2 months into our relationship when the day of our first argument arrived. It was over a misunderstanding on her part, if it matters to you. As fate would have it, this was also the day when I believed I was cursed. October 23, 2017. My mother suffers from rheumatoid arthritis, and has to have a disability scooter to get about freely outside. As luck would have it, her old scooter began to pack up in the summer. Finally, after the rear wheel on the right-hand side became impacted, we decided to sell it. My mother put it for sale online along with my mobile number, as she doesn't have one. Unknown to me, my mother had spoken to someone online and had agreed to sell it. Due to a mix-up with the days, the people who came to look at the scooter turned up a day earlier than my mother expected. Not knowing anything about this, I was at my mother's house on my own when they turned up. Instead of knocking at the door or calling, the ignorant people just began to wheel the scooter away down the driveway. Hearing this, I went outside and confronted the two people, accusing them of stealing. They were dark-skinned, greasy-looking people, both of them in their 40s, I'd say, a man and a woman. I told them to get their hands off it and keep away. Due to the fact I'd argued with my girlfriend that very morning, I was in a bad mood and ranted at them. They explained they'd arranged to pick it up, but I didn't believe them. I also pointed out that even if what they were saying was true, they had no right to turn up and start looking at the scooter without first knocking on the door. The man didn't seem to want trouble, and merely threw back a few insults at me before leaving. The woman remained, shouting back at me. I did say some horrible things to her. I called her ugly and said she smelt bad. I even went so far as to say she didn't deserve to be breathing. I can't quite explain what came over me. I had never felt anger like it. Anyway, she seemed to leave and I went back inside and started to call my mother. But then, I heard the sound of mumbling at the front door. I opened it and she was standing there, a glazed expression on her face, as though she was in a trance. I told her to leave or I would call the police. She laughed quietly and then said exactly this. "Misfortune will rain upon you. May you be dead within 1 year." She said exactly that. Not "you will be dead by the end of the year," meaning 2017, but "may you be dead within 1 year." I laughed at her and slammed the door. I did not call the police as she and her male friend, husband, boyfriend, brother, left in their large white van. I was later told off by my mother at my handling of the situation. My grandmother then informed me that these people are probably gypsies, and that they travel around looking for scarp in their van, as she had seen them a few times before. I didn't tell anyone about what the woman had said before she left. The next day, I noticed that she had vandalized the scooter. Well, she hadn't, really. All she had done is pull off a small plastic cap that fits underneath the seat. I remember that there was a piece of paper jammed inside it. I tried to pry it out but couldn't as the neck of the cap was too thin. I'm not sure how she jammed it in there. I thought little of it and merely put the cap back into place. The following week, the scooter was sold to a company that refurbishes mobility scooters. From this moment on, my life has utterly fell to pieces. November 2017. I know this is already beginning to drag, so I'll say the next part of my tale quickly. My girlfriend and I broke up under bad circumstances. I was as though she had an entire personality transplant. She came from a Muslim background and seemed to be a woman with good morals, but it turns out she was secretly working as an escort. She'd never seemed greedy, she'd never asked for money. And yet I felt used. We broke up and I was left broken-hearted. To get my mind off my woes, my mother suggested we both take a break and go spend a few days in the caravan in Wales. I didn't feel like going back to the place where I'd first met my girlfriend, but I didn't want to disappoint my mother, so I went with her. Now, here's the part where I can prove my tale. I don't know if any of you are in the UK, but there's a magazine over here called Take a Break, Fate, and Fortune. It's all about people's tales of encounters with otherworldly creatures. Well, my mother wrote up the mag last month. A small part of my tale is in the story. The picture my mother sent of me is several years old, in case you're wondering why I look like a teenager. The story is on the front of the magazine, entitled, "Demon in Disguise Wanted Us Dead." My mother never wrote this headline, the editor put that to make it sound more scary. For on that November trip, we both seemed to encounter a hellhound, a demon from hell. We were out taking a walk through the most deserted caravan site, when it suddenly ran out in front of us. It was all black and seemed to have the back legs of a rabbit. You know, it seemed to hop off them. It looked at us both with flaming red eyes. I tried to keep my cool, tried to convince my logical mind that it was a dog of some kind. But it wasn't. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to. My mother fled and so did I. My grandfather didn't seem to believe us when we told him, but I knew what I'd seen. Still, afterwards, I did somehow manage to convince myself that it was just a trick in the dark. A large fox or something. My superstitious mother believed it was indeed a devil dog, a being sent to terrorize or bring unhappiness to a victim. December 2017. In this month, a deep, dark depression hit me. It got so bad that I started gambling more often to make myself feel better. Gambling has always been my one and only vice. But this was unlike anything before. Not only did the gambling bug bite me hard, But it also brought with it a terrible run of bad luck. I'd never known anything like it before. It got so bad that I eventually lost all my savings and ended up having a thoroughly miserable Christmas. Thanks to the aid of Gamblers Anonymous, I accepted my losses and resolved to never gamble for such high stakes ever again. January, February and March 2018. My depression still remained, though. The blackness I felt over me was terrible. It got so bad that I even felt like killing myself. Life seemed so worthless all of a sudden. I felt as though I was wasting away. Eventually, after reaching breaking point, my mother saw through my mask that I was wearing and got me some much-needed help. The road to recovery was quick, actually. The moment my therapist made me realize that I was ill, I began to improve. I got a new job, started dating again. By the end of March I felt as though I'd turned a corner. Everything seemed fine, until the bottom fell out beneath me. April 2018. Having returned to the caravan in March for a brief holiday, I returned there in early April for a weekend visit. Now here's a part of the tale that clashes with my mother's account of things. To make it sound better for the story submitted to the magazine, she said this event occurred in January. In actuality, it happened in April. I went up to the wardrobe in my bedroom, when a black mass seemed to shoot out of it. It was like a blur. It looked like a small orb. It went so fast that I span around and fell to the floor, briefly losing consciousness for a couple of seconds. I was terribly shaken by this. For the first time in my life, I began to suspect that there was a world I never dreamed possible existing alongside ours. Since this moment, my mother will never return to the caravan. She sold it to my grandparents shortly afterwards. I still go back there, though. Unlike my mother, I refuse to believe that the caravan itself is cursed. May 2018. After the traumatic event in the caravan was when I first began to think long and hard on the cure the gypsy woman had placed on me. But the moment I began to worry about it, was when it seemed to gain more power over me. Out of all the months, May was one of the worst. First of all, my great-aunt's bank account was raided. She was completely cleaned out, losing over £60,000. The bank were hopeless in helping her, as they say her account had been emptied over a period of months without her knowledge. My aunt is rather odd, and doesn't lock her door when going out. The bank blamed her for allowing people access to her home and card and called her out on her not noticing funds disappearing from her accounts sooner. She never checked her balance and doesn't do online banking. I also become very ill. I kept getting colds all the time. But they weren't like normal colds, they were more like flu. But it's never gone away. Honestly, I have rarely felt well ever since May. Every time a cold goes away, I catch another within weeks, or stomach bugs and such. My mother also fell ill. She got a terrible kidney infection that almost killed her, as she collapsed in pain and lost consciousness. To top it off, I was fired from my new job for not turning up to work one day, having slept in, something I've never done before. And now comes the month of death. June 2018. Myself and my family members have always loved animals. We own dogs, cats and rabbits. But we lost an unusual amount of pets in June. 4, to be exact. How does that happen to seemingly healthy animals? First of all, my mother's pet rabbit suddenly died. This is not uncommon with rabbits to suddenly die, so I didn't think much of it. But then my uncle's dog had to be put down, after the vet discovered it had cancer when it collapsed one day out of the blue. Then my mother's elderly cat suddenly died, and finally my best friend's dog was killed when it escaped from the garden and was hit by a car. I wasn't sure whether or not to include this one considering it didn't actually belong to the family. At the very end of the month my mother was again hit by another kidney infection, but this time she spotted the signs sooner. Small things happening again and again. Someone duplicated my grandfather's license plate and was caught on camera speeding, leaving him with a penalty fee to pay. Someone broke into my shed and another night I heard the sound of running feet on my path in the early hours of the morning. Another day someone actually tried to open the door. My grandparents live in a council house, and this year, for the first time in over a decade, the council insisted on an inspection, and ended up saying that the house was not up to regular standards, meaning they might end up being forced out of their home, the place they have lived for nearly 40 years now. Old debts from years ago have come back to haunt my mother, debt collectors and bailiffs turning up from every direction on a constant basis. As things stand, my grandparents might lose the caravan as well as their home, as one of the debts is in my grandfather's name, and they now know that the caravan is in his name. Finally, we reach the moment where the supernatural began to take over my very life. July 2018. Mysterious noises again happening in the night, that only I can seem to hear. My lady friend heard nothing when she stayed over on 2 different nights. The sense of being followed and demon-like figures haunting me in my sleep, informing me that my time allowed to prepare is almost over. Yes, that's what July brought. For the first time in my life I suffered from nightmarish sleep paralysis. Again and again it has happened, each time becoming more and more severe, culminating with a dark figure telling me that my time is almost up to prepare for my death. My face looks pale and horrible now. I feel cold all the time and isolated from the rest of humanity. I ventured outside one night to go to the cash point, ATM, needing the money that night in order to pay my grandfather some money I owed him. It was when I was outside in the wee hours, that it appeared. It was like a blur in my eye corner at first, just a sprinting blur. But I could hear it. It sounded like growling, like thunder. And I know it must seem crazy, but a mist seemed to appear, and I could swear it came after me, as I walked and then eventually ran back towards my house. The streets were deserted and whatever it was seemed to be following me. It seemed to be right behind me when I fell over right outside my house, and then it just went away as fast as it had come. The mists, the sounds, the feeling, everything. It was as though whatever it was letting me know that the end wasn't here just yet, but that this is what my final fate is. Ever since that day, I have started to actually believe what's happening. This month has all but confirmed my suspicions, as I now face the wrath of the law for a crime I did not commit. August 2018. In a few days' time I am due to speak with the police again. I have already been arrested once. And why? For stealing all my aunt's money. Yes, I have been framed. I know some of my family do not believe me, including my reclusive great-aunt, but it is the truth. My gambling addiction taking its toll in December makes it look bad, as though I tried to recoup my losses through stealing my aunt's money. The evidence they have against me is that the money was passed through online accounts of mine before being transferred to a bogus bank account. I know it's my own fault, as my security is poor online. I use the same passwords for everything. Early last year my aunt wanted some special light bulbs, so she gave me her card and I registered it on PayPal. Whoever it was who took her money didn't steal her card, they hacked my account and transferred the funds to a new bank account they set up. It's my own fault for rarely using my PayPal account, or else I would have noticed. The only trouble is, the police don't believe me. They think it's all my doing. But I know it can't be just mere poor detective work on the part of the police, as this could have happened months ago when her money vanished. It just seems to be as the curse progresses, things get worse and worse for me. At a complete loss, and reaching a serious crisis of faith, I did something I haven't done for years, even though I have always believed. I went to church and prayed. I didn't ask for divine intervention, I merely asked for the answer and so with it the question. And I think I received it. That same night, I went home and my mother was watching an old horror movie on TV called Night of the Demon, 1957. I had never seen it before, but the events of the film seemed to mirror what is happening to me. Of course, with it being a film everything is super exaggerated, but the main character is cursed. The only way he can break the curse is by handing the runic symbols back to the person who cursed him. Maybe it's just me, but I feel as though God sent me a message that night. Ever since then I can't forget that rolled up piece of paper inside that plastic cap on the scooter. I willingly picked the cap up, accepting the curse. If my hunch and online research is true, it has to be cast back at the person who gave it to you in order to break it. But the trouble is, I no longer have it, and I'm running out of time. I still haven't told my family what the woman said to me that day on October the 23rd, but I did ask my grandmother if she'd seen that van going around ever then. She hasn't. And neither have I, despite my efforts. All trace of them seems to have disappeared. I called the company who bought the scooter, but they no longer have it. It was cleaned up, the impacted wheel removed and sold. I'm hoping that the plastic cap underneath the seat was never removed. I see no reason why it would be. If I could get the paper back and give it back to the woman who cursed me, would it be broken? But then again, since I no longer possess the paper or the scooter, shouldn't the curse now be on the owner of the scooter? Sorry if I'm sounding hysterical, but with every day that passes I feel as though mental disintegration sets in further. I don't know what to believe anymore. I know it is coming, I feel it in my bones. I need help. For those of you who have taken the time to read all this, again I thank you. Bless you. Any and all advice on how to stop this would be appreciated. Am I right in my thinking on how to stop this? If October the 23rd is to be the day of my demise, you can see why I'm anxious. It isn't too far away now. And the coincidences are too great to ignore. I only hope this can be stopped before it's too late. Story 18, The Little Boy Lurking Behind the Camera. This all began back when I was on vacation and I was so excited to finally spend time with my family abroad. Everything started out as normal. Me and my baby cousin, who was just 3, would spend every waking moment together, as I didn't have much time and I was only there for the month. One day he was taking pictures with his dad's phone. He just loves to take pictures of everything and everyone, even a blank wall would be worth grabbing. So of course I joined in, thinking it would be a laugh taking close-up selfies with him. At first he was very hesitant, which was kind of strange knowing that this was his obsession, but a mere seconds later he was willing to do so. We took a really silly selfie and saved it as souvenir. Well, I did, but he wouldn't take another. Soon after, when I tried to view back the picture we took, he kind of just shoved me away, not letting me see the selfie we took. I didn't think any of it at first. Suddenly he would start acting strange, like out of nowhere he would start crying and he would be very clingy towards his mum, more than usual, and I know what kid isn't. That was the only thing that stopped me from saying anything, though I did get a weird feeling that not everything is as it seemed. Fast forward to the end of our holidays, things still kept feeling weird, but I got over it. Even when he would be scared to go to sleep, and not just the regular kind, as in you could feel the sheer terror of him not wanting to go sleep, I still didn't think anything of it. But a week or so after we got home, my aunt, the mother of my baby cousin, was really disturbed to find the selfie that we took on my uncle's phone. At first I thought it was an edit, as in he had copied and pasted another copy of his face on top of his actual face, and I didn't believe anything of it. My mum showed it to me and she was like, "Who is this?" Me being really confused, I said clearly, "That's just someone playing around," until I took a closer look and realized there was no way he could have done that. He was too young to do so, and that the boy behind us was not a cropped out photo of my baby cousin but someone else. Me being really freaked out that I had received the same photo on my phone, I didn't know what to do. Maybe this had the answer. It couldn't possibly be a coincidence that he was acting strange and that he didn't want me to see the photo, or his odd behavior, especially how he looked at me, gave me chills down my spine. What freaked me out even more was that prior to our visit my aunt swore that she saw a shadow of a small boy on his hands and knees move across to the room where he sleeps during the night. Story 19, Ancestors. Seeing the interest, if not small interest, that my symbiosis story generated, I got to thinking. I realized that the incident of my unfortunate bug-infested classmate wasn't the first time I'd encountered something scary and or out of the ordinary. My memories of this event I'm about to tell are a bit hazy and have only come to my conscious mind recently, as if I was suppressing this all these years. Perhaps you'll see why. It was about 2005 and I happened to be 5 years old. At the time, the internet was in a somewhat primitive state, so for entertainment I liked to look at the many photo albums that my mom kept around the house. Sometimes my mom would tell me stories behind the photos and let my imagination run wild with ideas of how my relatives and ancestors lived. On one certain day, I was looking at pictures of my late great-grandmother Mary. My dad had a time-consuming job as a construction worker at the time and was gone most of the day. My mom would work from home while she was pregnant with my little brother Joseph. She was sitting at the kitchen table, comparing the numbers on a paper to the numbers punched into her laptop that was reserved for work use only. I was on the hardwood kitchen floor, leaning on a pillow as I leafed through the pictures of my great-grandmother Mary, smiling happily with her friends and husband, who was Great-Grandpa Jack. The pictures were from the 1930s, about the time when Grandma Mary had peaked. The photos were in black and white, and the dress she wore went all the way down to her shins. She looked so young and happy, oblivious to her not-so-optimistic future. Of course, at the time I didn't know this, but she had lived through the Great Depression and was one of the many who suffered the consequences of the unstable economy. I flipped the page I was on, smiling as I saw more happy pictures of my great-grandmother. My smile faded when my eyes drifted to an image in the middle of the page. It was a photo of a group of people, both mixed men and women, and I could see my great-grandpa Jack. Right next to him was assumably Grandma Mary, but her face looked like it had been scratched off. Where her head should have been was instead just a white mark. Everyone else in the picture looked happy and fine, so why was Grandma's so messed up? Mom? I asked my mother, who took a second to respond. Yeah, hun? She asked, tearing her eyes away from her computer. Why's this photo look weird? I asked. I saw my mother push her chair out and I handed the photo album up to her to make it easier for her. Grandma's face is gone. My mother looked down at the photo and I could just see the look in her eyes of pure panic. She had completely tensed up and her eyes were fixed on the photo. I shifted in my spot, starting to feel anxious from her taking so long to respond. Mum? She snapped back to the present. She looked down at me and blatantly forced a smile. Oh, sweetie, this is just a mistake. Those cameras back then weren't as good as they are now. Here, I'll just take this photo out, she said, sliding the photo out of the clear plastic. She handed the photo album back to me. Now there was just an empty white space where the photo was. Without a word, my mother got up from the table and headed upstairs. I didn't move due to some unspoken fear within me. I simply listened as I could hear my mother shuffling around upstairs. A few minutes later, she came back down and acted like everything was normal. I kept my mouth shut and didn't bring up the subject again for the rest of the day. A few days later, I was playing with some stuffed animals in my room just after dinner time. I enjoyed making up backstories and conflicts between each stuffed animal, similarly to how I'd try to imagine how my ancestors lived. I was simply holding two of my stuffed animals and making them talk when I smelled something weird. It sort of smelled like when my mom would accidentally burn food. At that time she was downstairs, probably working. I got up and opened my door, looking down the hallway that led to the upstairs bathroom and my parents' room. I wasn't allowed in my parents' room that often, only if I had a nightmare and couldn't sleep or something. My parents' room was just above the kitchen, and my mind wandered to the previous day when I had pointed out the picture to my mother. I never knew what happened to that picture, but I realized. The shuffling I heard that day came from their room. I carefully turned to listen down the stairs to make sure my mom was distracted. I heard the faint tapping of her on her computer, still at work. I turned my attention to her bedroom again and slowly walked towards it, my feet silent on the carpeted floor. I pressed my hand against the door and slowly pushed it open to see the room. It hadn't changed much since I last was in here, save for a large curtain that was draped across two desks. The burning smell was much stronger in here. The rest of the room looked typical. There was a bureau with my mother's makeup on it to my right next to the bed, and to my left were closet doors. Obviously, my gut instinct said to check the curtain. I carefully continued to walk towards the curtain, which was a dusty beige color. I grabbed the curtain and lifted it to reveal a gaping hole in the wall. I froze. I never once knew about this hole my entire life that I lived here. On the other side of the hole was what looked like a bright yellowish room, but from there I couldn't see what exactly was in it. I stepped inside the hole, careful to not make sound again, and appeared out the other side. The room probably only about 4 feet wide by 6 feet tall. Surrounding the perimeter of the room was an odd line of what looked like white powder. I stepped onto it and it made a crunch sound. It must have been either salt or sugar, for who knew why. There were melted candles, which were all lit, contributing to the yellowish glow of the room. Against the far wall was a statue of Mother Mary. We were indeed Catholic, but it wasn't an incredibly important role in our lives. We hardly went to church, so finding a statue puzzled me. At Mother Mary's feet was a small plate with a bundle of what looked like odd twigs laying on it. I learned later that this was a bundle of sage. Looking back up, I felt a sense of dread riddle my system. I just then realized that tacked onto the wall was the picture that my mother took away yesterday. Grandma's face was still whited out of the picture. But it wasn't just that photo. There were several hundred other photos tacked onto the wall, and they all had one thing in common: someone's face was scratched out. Giving a quick glance over them, I realized I recognized a lot of these photos. I remember seeing them in that photo album looking normal. Then, without me noticing it, they must have been removed and placed up here. I was about to leave and ask my mom what all this was when the candlelight dimmed. It felt as though the room's temperature dropped several degrees. I was frozen in fear, too scared to even run. I felt some unseen presence here, and the anxiety crippled me. It then began to feel like the whole room was shaking. It sounded like there was some thunderstorm raging just outside the room. I screamed and rolled into a ball on the floor, desperately hugging my knees. "Anna!" my mom exclaimed, who had suddenly appeared outside the hole. She entered the room with me and grabbed me with her left arm. "Get out of here, Mary. You're not going to have him," she screamed. She grabbed the bundle of twigs and quickly tried lighting it with the candles in the room. She pulled me so that we were in the middle of the room, right in the center of the salt or sugar circle. She held the sage bundle above her head, waving around herself and me as the shaking of the room intensified. I couldn't stop screaming. My mother was trying to say something above the noise of the deafening rumbling, but I couldn't make it out. Then, as soon as it started, it all stopped. The candles were all fully lit again, the shaking stopped, and there was no sound except my throbbing heartbeat. "Come on," my mother said, squeezing out of the room and pulling me with her. She tried to wipe away the tears from my eyes once we were sitting in her room. Mom. Were you talking to Grandma Mary?" I asked shakily once I was given a second to breathe. Despite how shaken I was, I desperately thirsted for some answers. My mother gave an exasperated sigh and held me close. "Sweetie," she started, "sometimes, some people are so desperate for a second chance at life that they try to take it from someone else. Grandma Mary was going to try to possess Joseph when he was born. She unfortunately wasn't the first who tried to do this, but luckily, she was the last." I wasn't fully sure what she meant at the time, but I just sat there, relieved to now be held in a loving embrace. We sat together in the room silently like this for a while, having grown closer from this event. 2 months later, my brother Joseph was born. I don't think he ever knew how close he was to not being able to live his own life, and I don't think he ever will. Later, my father got a better paying job elsewhere, and so we moved, leaving behind the seance room, and hopefully, leaving behind the torment from my ancestors. Story 20, I keep seeing a light outside my window. Moving from London was a pretty big deal for me. I worked at a large publishing house, reading manuscripts for cookbooks. It's a niche job, but someone has to do it. To be honest, cooking isn't really my strong suit. I'd been shunted sideways from reading popular science manuscripts, but I came to enjoy scanning through the recipes, sometimes picking up the ingredients on the way home from work and experimenting. That would usually end in the smoke alarm going off and Mrs. Hobson downstairs banging on her ceiling with a walking stick. I'd turn it off and then order something from Just Eat. Usually sushi. It's semi-healthy, right? Then my Uncle John died and they thought they would sell his house. I was looking to move out of London anyway, away from smoggy mornings and my cramped studio flat. I'd saved up a small deposit and my grandparents, who were dealing with the sale, gave me a massively reduced price, and so I found myself here on the side of a moor in Yorkshire. The house is one of those higgledy-piggledy houses. The slate is dark grey, almost black, even in daylight. It sits alone on the edge of the moor, a dark shadow rising up out of the morning mist. It's foreboding, even on a summer's day with the muted purple of the heather and the sunny yellow blooms of gorse dotted around, but I don't mind. Even as a child I was melancholy, spending afternoons watching rain trickle down the window pane, and this house matched my personality perfectly. Plus, no one to make a racket when the smoke alarm went off. Moving in wasn't very stressful, I didn't have very much. Mum and Dad gave me a lift up in their car, with my dad telling me, repeatedly, all up the A1, that it was time for me to learn to drive. Mum sat in silence, her fingers sometimes threading through her hair. She took the loss of her brother hard, even though there were 19 years between them. I remember her directionless gaze at the funeral, her jumpiness at every hand on the shoulder. It wasn't too unusual for her. She is where my melancholy streak comes from. She is small and nervous, a deer perpetually caught in headlights. When she laughs it sounds like bird song. It's my favorite thing about her. When we got there the house was chilly and our footsteps echoed however much we tried to mute them. The decor was a lot to be desired, faded wallpaper and musty carpets in the 5 bedrooms upstairs, dark wooden floors and paneled walls everywhere else. The smell of damp hung in the air. I found the switch for the heating and it rattled into life, creaking and groaning as the pipes expanded. We dug out my kettle and some mugs from the only box marked kitchen in my ragged scrawl, and Mum pulled some tea bags from her purse. After the tea, my parents left, my dad kissing my cheek and my mum touching my shoulder as if it were my brother that were lost. The next few weeks were as you'd expect. There was no phone line running to the house and BT said it would be a few weeks before they could get an engineer out, plus my phone couldn't get a single bar of signal from any room in the house. It was isolating, but I felt fiercely independent, walking half an hour across the moor to the nearest bus stop, and then buying food and supplies in the first village the bus stopped in. If you stayed on the bus for another 40 minutes, you'd come to a town, and one day I went in and picked up a can of paint and a paintbrush for the room I'd chosen as my own. Carrying everything back was a bitch, but every day I felt stronger, braced by the fresh air. I'd be back to work, freelancing now, in a few weeks, and I wanted the house to be habitable by the time I started. Which leads me to the last few nights, the reason I'm writing, really. The night before last, I was tossing and turning on my airbed in the room I had chosen, one with wide bay windows that look out onto the moor. A mist had settled in that evening, but with all the hot weather of the last few weeks, coupled with the near-constant rain of the last day, I had expected mist. I tossed and turned, my shoulder bumping the hard floor where the bed had deflated. I wasn't sure if it was my shoulder or the flash that woke me, but suddenly I was wide awake and staring at the ceiling. I registered another flash, lightning, perhaps, but far away because it was too dim to be nearby. I strained my ears for the sound of thunder, but none came. I decided to get up, wrapping my comforter around me, in the hope that in opening the window I could hear a crack of thunder. I loved storms, especially ones watched from inside, a mug of hot chocolate in hand. The window creaked as I threw it open and I waited for a resounding crash to echo across the open space before me, but there was only silence. I saw another flash then, on the moor. It looked like torchlight, but if it were a torch, whoever was wielding it would have to be around 11 feet tall. I tried to think if there were any roads that intersected where I had seen the light, but the nearest road was the one where I caught the bus, much more westward than the flashing light. I shrugged, dismissing it, and went to turn away, but again the light caught my eye. This time it was pulsating, and it reminded me, briefly, of a lighthouse at sea. Something about it intrigued me, and I couldn't drag my gaze away. Eventually, I caught myself and laughed for being so silly. I went back to the airbed, lay down and closed my eyes, seeing the flash dancing behind my closed eyelids until I fell into a fitful sleep. I didn't think about it yesterday at all, really. I was resolved that a new bed had to come soon. My body was stiff from sleeping on the air mattress that begun the night plump and firm, but had withered and died when morning came. I caught the bus into the village and sat in the only cafe, nursing a hot chocolate and using all my data replying to emails and browsing the IKEA website. When I went to bed, I fell quickly into a dreamless sleep, only to be woken by the crash of the window as it flung itself open, the frame smashing into the grey slate. I jumped up and hurried over, expecting to see broken glass sparkling in the moonlight, but the single pane of glass was still intact. I reached out to shut the window, when I saw the light again. My first thought was that it must be campers, and I was irrationally annoyed, but then I looked again. The beam of it was pulsing, rhythmically, and again it seemed to be directed at the house. It hung, suspended above the earth, slowly, steadily fading in and out. I squinted to make out its source in the pale moonlight, but couldn't see anything. All was perfectly still, apart from the slow fade of the light before me. I resolved to go to bed and head out first thing to investigate, but I couldn't stop staring at it. I watched it, feeling my eyes grow heavy, and then this morning I woke, the wind whipping strands of hair into my face. I was slumped against the window, my ribs bruising against the sill that ran around it. Every muscle aches. I've resolved to go and look once I've posted this online and got the bus back to the moor. I'm sure it's nothing, but I have a niggling feeling it's not nothing, and it's meant for me somehow. Still, that could be the lack of sleep talking. I'll definitely write about what I find next time I'm in the village. Probably some kids being stupid, and we'll all have a good laugh about you/echoes and stars making a mountain out of a molehill.